On this episode of Still Loading, stay a while and listen. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this new episode of the Still Loading Podcast. I'm your host, Josh Koval, and today on the show, we are diving into a pretty influential game in the dungeon crawler genre. Arguably, I guess it's not technically the founder, but it's one of the most influential games in the genre, just period. And joining me to discuss this iconic title is a friend of mine from the Retro Hangover Podcast. And I can't do the intro the way Chris does it, so I'm going to do it a little bit differently than he does. Joining me today for this episode is the dungeon crawler himself, Shane Dick Dragon Koski. Because we can't, Chris screamed it, so I had to whisper it into the microphone.
No, that makes sense. I wouldn't recommend that anybody do what Chris does, just as like a general rule of thumb, honestly. But
I can only imagine no one's going to know the context of that, and I intro the episode just whispering Dick Dragon. And
there's I'm very uncomfortable now.
Why is he doing this? Why is the episode starting this way? But no, Shane, thank you so much for joining me on this episode. First time on the show, Chris gets around a bunch, and I've been meaning to have you on for. So I mean, he does, but no. But no, I've been meaning to have you on the podcast for a while, and from listening to your show, I know you're a gigantic Diablo fan, so True. I had to have you on to talk about Diablo. So to kick it all off, kind of similar to what you do in Retro Hangover, we're talking about personal experiences first, and I want to hear from you, the guest. What is your personal experience with Diablo, the series, and then specifically Diablo 1?
Oh man, I mean, how much time do you have? How long are these episodes?
We can go 2 hours. We're fine.
The first 4-hour episode of Still Loading Podcast. My history with the Diablo series is storied, let's say, prolific, perhaps. If you're familiar with me at all, I'm sure there's got to be some in the Venn diagram of podcasts. I'm sure there are some folks listening right now who maybe know who I am. I don't know. But if you do, then you know that I've talked about Diablo quite a bit. I'll basically talk about Diablo to anybody willing to listen. Hence why I'm here. And it's like, not even arguably, it is absolutely one of, if not my top favorite game series of all time. And the funny thing about it is, in recent years, I've been flip-flopping on this one because everybody's popular answer is Diablo 2, right? Like, that's always the one. That
was the first one I played. So I've played Diablo 1, 2, and 3. Have not touched 4, but I've played all of them technically.
Yeah. And so like the typical answer is always Diablo 2, with good reason. And there's a lot of arguments to be made that it is sort of like the pinnacle of ARPGs, even still. I mean, there's a lot of great contenders out there, but, and I was of that camp for a long time. And as I've gotten older, I've come to realize that I actually think Diablo 1 beats it out for me. Yeah.
Interesting.
And we'll go into why probably a little bit later, but suffice to say, I think it's edged it out a little bit. And my history with it goes pretty far back. And this is me like trying to reach back into arguably memories that are probably lost to time now. But I don't think I got it right at release, because that was 1996. Well, 1995. There's actually an ongoing debate about that. But
in our one mutual server that we're on.
yeah, exactly. I call it 1996, but evidently it's maybe technically 95. But anyway, right around that time. I don't think I got it exactly then, but it was pretty close. And it was one of the first PC games I really ever played. My family had a compact Presario, one of those giant gray boxes of a computer as our family computer, which is a concept that I'm pretty sure anybody like younger than 30 has no idea what that means.
Mm-hmm.
But it came with some games. It had Descent, it had Magic Carpet, a couple other things. And so that blew my mind anyway with the 3D, but that's a story for a different day. But one of the ones that I picked up fairly soon after was, in fact, Diablo. And I am not being hyperbolic when I say that this game completely changed how I viewed video games. And that's largely because up until this point, I was pretty much just a Nintendo kid. So my idea of what a video game was Nintendo. It was very friendly, very colorful, very sort of like a light experience, like nothing real heavy or anything.
Yeah.
And Diablo is one of the first games where I was just like, oh, no, these are things that are possible in video games. And I actually credit Diablo with my sort of like enduring appreciation for dark fantasy, like artwork and settings and things like that. I actually honestly think Diablo is the reason why I like Dark Souls.
Okay, I could see that, and I think the setting is one of the most enduring parts of the series in general. And real quick before we continue on, it was actually released in 96, officially released in 97 with a broken street date in 96. I think you said 95, 96. It was actually
that's what it was. Yeah.
Because it was supposed to be released in January in 97, but a couple West Coast retailers, according to the citation here on Wikipedia, broke street date and began selling it on December 31st, 1996. But so no, but back to the setting. I'm with you on it. I think it's one of the most endearing aspects about, and not in. Maybe endearing is the right word, but it's definitely enduring. For me, the reason why I'll get to my personal experience in a second, but to kind of piggyback off what you're talking about with this, I think one of the reasons the setting and the whole environment of this game really spoke to me, not because of necessarily the darkness, but I've said it before on the show, I grew up pretty religious. I grew up in a conservative Christian household. And so seeing these types of elements, it didn't feel taboo, believe it or not, because my parents, while they were conservative and they still are conservative and Christian, they were never the type that were like totally like, oh, you can't play that. That's crazy talk. Like that's evil. They were like that with some things. Dungeons and Dragons they thought were satanic. Pokemon had evolution, so that was a no-no. They thought Harry Potter promoted witchcraft. It was a whole bunch of stuff. Let me tell you, man, evangelical world, I love my parents to death, but there's some wild stuff in it. Wild stuff that gets roped around in there. But in any case, so when I would see this and it was like talking about Diablo and Satan and going to hell, and it maybe it spoke to the inner Christian in me and the idea of like it, because a lot of the demons they name in the games appear in the Bible as well. And so it kind of had this like connection for me, I think, like subconsciously. I don't think I really recognized it as a kid, but when you see like, Belial, I believe that was a boss from Diablo 2, and then obviously Diablo himself, Satan, it just really resonated with me as a kid. And for my own personal experience, I first played Diablo 2, then I played Diablo 3, and I actually played Diablo 1 for this episode. And just to get this out at the beginning, listeners, I was not able to beat this game. It is brutally difficult. I will say, though, I played the PS1 version of it. And while it is a very good port, I'm not denying that. It's actually considered one of the best ports of a PC game to like a home console out there. It's definitely nowhere near as good as what it was intended for on the PC, because in Diablo style gameplay, you click around on the screen to move, and you also click to attack, and generally you use the right click to do your special move, whatever you have like equipped to your right click. I'm assuming that's the same as it was back then too. Like you still had the left and right click for all this, correct? Because like I said, I played on the PlayStation 1, so I didn't get to technically experience it the original way.
Yeah, that's pretty much the setup. And that was part of why, and not to jump too far ahead, but that's part of why like some of that design got I won't say fixed, but let's say streamlined in the sequel, because your left click is basically dedicated solely to just your basic character attack and picking up items and things like that. And the right click, you only had that one slot. Now, granted, you had hotkeys, which were the function keys on the keyboard, but only certain function keys, by the way. It was only like F5 through like F8, I think, that you could assign spells and scrolls to. So you could sort of hot swap that right click, but it could get a little clunky, especially in the heat of combat. You got to be really good about slamming those hotkeys if you need to like emergency teleport like out of dodge,
which will happen frequently when you're playing this game.
Yeah.
It is brutally difficult. So my personal experience was playing it for the first time for this, still finding it pretty enjoyable, even though I was playing the PlayStation 1 version on my PlayStation 3. Like the physical disc, the PS1 disc. I had the PS1 physical copy.
You have the disc?
Yeah.
Nice.
Right there. There's my copy right there. Diablo 1 for
Love it.
PS1. And this one was cool, though, because it was an easier way to play two-player co-op, because you could plug a second controller in, and that was a lot harder on Diablo 1, because I guess netcode wasn't as good back then, and obviously it was a PC title, so you would have to play, like, you'd have to LAN connect to each other somehow, I'm assuming.
Yeah,
Either that or do it through... I don't even think BattleNet existed yet.
So it did, actually.
Oh, did it? Okay.
It did. It was like the sort of nascent version of BNet back in the day. And yeah, so much like a lot of games back then, there was a certain amount of legwork that you had to do if you wanted to play multiplayer. Like,
yep.
We're spoiled now because you just launch a game and go into a lobby and you're like, boom, here I am. But with something like Diablo, if you wanted to play with other people, you could set up a local LAN, but even with that, like, you would still have to futz around with stuff like, what is the target machine's like local IP address so I can connect to them and like all that stuff. So yeah, the PlayStation version definitely makes that way simpler. But you did have Battle.net, but even then, BNet was a lawless wasteland back then. It was rife with cheating. And they didn't really address that until sort of the revamp of Battle.net when Diablo 2 came out. So Diablo itself, and technically I think the service is still live today. So if you want to jump in there, I believe you still can.
I wouldn't be surprised. Blizzard surprisingly supports a lot of their old stuff.
They do, yeah. So it's possible that you could jump in there now and probably witness some of this even in the current year, but it was very common to come across people with just jacked, like, hacked characters that would just come in and just one-shot you in town and crazy stuff like that. So on the other flip side, part of that Wild West feel of the early internet too, right, is like you also came across some genuinely nice people where they'd just like jump into your game and just drop a bunch of like cool shit and be like, here you go, have fun. So
yep. God, I miss some of that. I remember even playing another Blizzard property. I remember playing like World of Warcraft, where people would just like, I'd be running around and then just drop some items for you and then just yeet off and be like, here you go.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was awesome. And of course, then you also had people who just gank you, and then you wouldn't be able to, they would camp outside of the low level areas. Like, cause in WoW, there's like areas where, like 0 through 10, they could enter there, but they couldn't attack you unless you attacked them first. Right. Once you got out of that zone, though, then it was just open season and you were just screwed. So you better hope that there's enough other high levels on your side to protect you.
And that is why I played on a PvE server.
I usually did too. No, so I played PvE, but no, sorry, we played PvP, but I would only ever do like PvE content. But that's another WoW's another game for another story for another day.
So what I find interesting though is your commentary about the different versions, because I surprised Chris with this when I brought it up a while back, but having played the PlayStation version of Diablo, as the person who grew up with the PC version and swore by it, I think I'm a convert in that
Really?
there are a lot of things in the PlayStation version that I personally think makes it the superior version of the game. I really do.
Interesting. We'll as we go along through kind of talk about the gameplay elements and mechanics and everything, and the specifics, I would love to hear the comparisons, because I only know the PlayStation version. Like my biggest beef with it is accuracy of attacking, but we'll get into all that in just a quick moment. Some quick behind the scenes, some quick fun facts about the game and just some tidbits I looked up. There's an awesome video on YouTube you can watch from Ars Technica. I don't know if you ever see their stuff, Shane, but they do this or their series called War Stories on YouTube.
Yep.
And
I've watched the video you're talking about. Actually, okay, I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yep. This is where I got pretty much all of my info directly from David Brevik himself. That's right. One of the lead designers of it. Development for the game actually began in late '93. The name of the game, Diablo, comes from actually where Brevik lived at the time. He lived in San Francisco, and he lived at the base of the Diablo mountain. And he thought that was just a cool name. He had no idea that Diablo meant devil or Satan or anything like remotely like religious or anything like that. And he just thought it was a cool name. And obviously, once he dug into it a little bit further, he found that out. He created a company called Condor initially, a game development company called Condor, and they were working on a game called Justice League Task Force for the Sega Genesis. And he joined Blizzard because when they were demoing Justice League Task Force as Condor, they met Blizzard, who at the time was Silicon and Synapse, at a trade show, and Blizzard, or Silicon and Synapse, was making the Super Nintendo version of the Justice League Task Force game that Condor was making the Genesis version. Neither one knew that the other was making it. It was just complete happenstance. They were located like right next to each other and met each other. But they hit it off, and when Blizzard kind of switched names and started designing their own thing, they basically said like, hey, if you have any game ideas, we're trying to start our own company and trying to get our own IPs. If you want to pitch anything, pitch it to us. And that's kind of how Diablo was born. We'll go into a little bit more as we talk about the gameplay. But let's go into the gameplay right now, because one thing I thought was like super interesting was the gameplay we know now of it's almost like it's not a point and click adventure, but it's like a point and click action game kind of, where you left click to move, and then your character moves to wherever you click, then you left click to attack the enemy with whatever weapon you have equipped. That was originally going to not be real time. It was going to be turn based, and it was heavily inspired by, hold on, I wrote it down. I think it was like Wizardry and Ultima, and specifically the games Umeria, I think it was Umeria and Angband. Yeah. But mostly Angband, and he loved the permadeath. So the turn-based combat with permadeath, so that way every decision you made he felt it had so much weight behind it. Have you played any of those other games that kind of influenced this?
Honestly, no. Those were a little bit before my time. Like, I'm somewhat familiar with Angband just because that's probably one of the more recognizable titles. Like, they also mention a game called Telengard that was released by Avalon Hill in like 1982 as being influence to Diablo, and I'm just like, yeah, I have no idea what that is either.
I do think it's funny, the visuals for like Angband and games like that were all like ASCII art.
Oh yeah. Yeah, the OG roguelikes, yeah.
Right? It's just such a so far removed from where video games are now. It's hard to imagine games were like that with just no actual graphics, just all ASCII art, like you would see it like the strategy guide FAQs on like GameFAQs.com or whatever. You know what I'm talking about, right? Where they would like do all the ASCII art for the titles. You ever see those? Oh, hell yeah. Yeah, actually, It's funny because I mentioned that at one point. It might have been on one of our Sunday streams. I don't know. But I bemoaned the disappearance of the sweet ASCII title art of the days of yore from the game FAQs, because nobody does that anymore. It's a lost art, man. I mean, really is. It's really unnecessary if you think about it, but it's kind of cool. Oh, yeah. I mean, it's completely unnecessary, but it is so worth it. I mean, I always appreciate it. But yeah, so they wanted it to be turn-based. Brevik wanted to be turn-based, and people at the company, both on his team, I believe it was Blizzard South, he worked at Blizzard North, kept pushing like, hey, make this real time, because like Warcraft was a runaway success because it was real time, so let's take that idea and apply it to your game as well. And he was vehemently against it. And when there was a hand vote with the people at the office, and he got outvoted. So if it wasn't for him taking that hand vote, Diablo would have looked significantly different. Like, it would not have been the same game in the slightest.
Well, yeah, and it's also just kind of wild. I can only imagine how he felt about that too, given that, I mean, Diablo was really Brevik's baby. Like, he conceived of the idea initially, and so for him to kind of get outvoted on his own project, I feel like it probably sucked at the time. But like, I know he's gone on record at, like, you know, GDC conferences and other places where he's done talks and just been like, yeah, it was the right choice, you know. So. Yeah.
I mean, that takes some humility, man, because I know if I was in his shoes, that would have been a hard pill for me to swallow.
Oh, for sure, yeah.
I don't know if I could have done it. So the vote happened, he got outvoted, and then he went to Blizzard higher ups. He's like, listen, we're gonna do this like you, because Blizzard higher ups were also pushing for it. And he's like, but it's going to take 3 months and a lot of extra money. He did it in one night. And he just didn't tell Blizzard. He just didn't tell the higher ups. So he got 3 months of extra development time by kind of just not telling the whole truth. Like, everyone came back. It was like on a Friday afternoon that he went up to Blizzard to tell them of the decision. And when he got back to the office, he sent everyone home, and by the end of the night, he had already converted everything over that needed to be, and he knew there was something there because he couldn't stop playing it. Like, he converted it relatively early, and he was just playing it late into the night that night, which I think is just awesome. He specifically wrote that he said his like guy walked up to a skeleton, and when he clicked on it and attacked it, the skeleton exploded, and that visceral feeling of the enemies exploding when on contact with your weapon is kind of what sold him on it. Would you say that's like one of the appeals for you, is just like, I think this game could not have worked so easily, but I think for me, the visceral feeling of every time you click an enemy, and like the combination of the sound effect and the dying animation is just so like viscerally satisfying. Is it the same for you? Do you agree with that?
Oh, 100%. It's actually one of the reasons I love it so much is exactly that, because the sound design in this game is absolutely superb. I don't think even if you had the same exact game mechanics, right, that it has now, without that very specific sound design and those choices that they made with all of that, if they didn't have that, I don't think it'd be the same experience at all, because there's this certain punchiness to everything that is, as Brevik kind of put it, very viscerally satisfying. And it doesn't matter whether you're swinging a sword or shooting a bow and arrow or even throwing a fireball, it still sounds like somebody's punching a slab of meat, like every time it hits something. If you think about it too much, it's a little nonsensical, but it works. And it's one of those deals where the sound effects from the monsters' deaths are also done so well that there are those things that, like, I will never forget. They're just so memorable and so just in your face. Like, however they did it, I don't know who it was. I don't know if they had a Foley artist. Kudos to whoever managed to do this. But one of them being the skeleton, the sound of the bones like clinking and falling apart when they die is just so well done. And it sounds like stupid, kind of, to say that, right? But it's true. And when you experience it, I think you kind of know what we're talking about here. But yeah, it really can't be understated. And it's something that is sorely lacking even from later entries in the Diablo series itself. It's one of the things that folks have done analyses on, specifically on like Diablo 3, because without going into too much of a diatribe on that, while I do like it, it is very much, it's basically like it's like an arcade shooter version of an action RPG.
Yeah, I agree.
And that's fine, but there's a lot of things that you miss with that. And if you do, and no one in their right mind is going to do this, but the folks that have, I'm glad that they did it so we can see it and have not put the hours into making it happen. But they did like spectral like analysis of the sound that's coming from the game. And if you do an analysis of like somebody playing Diablo 1, you see a lot of spikes, right, in the sound, where it's like there's very low like ambiance and stuff, which we're going to talk about later because that's also fantastic. But there's the low hum of like the ambient music, and then you'll get these spikes where you're attacking things and enemies are dying. And that's important because it keeps things fresh. And then if you look at an analysis of like the sound that's getting pumped out of something like Diablo 3, it's basically just a wall of sound. There's no variance at all. And so everything is balanced basically at the same sort of level, I guess, to where everything just sort of blends together, and there aren't any of these peaks and valleys, and so it just starts to all become background noise at some point.
I can see where they're coming from with that, and also like that would make more sense, because so Diablo 3, I'm kind of with you where I think it's fine as well. I actually personally, because I do want to do an episode on it at some point, personally I don't think it was good until the expansion pack got added.
Agreed.
But that was just me.
Well, you could also make that argument about Diablo 2, but I'm sure that would piss off a few people.
We'll get to that when we talk Diablo 2 in however many months, or whenever I do that episode. But it's by having the juxtaposition is what makes it interesting. When everything is the same, when everything is too samey, you kind of get lulled into almost like, sleep might not be the right term, but maybe like mentally, like mentally you're not nearly as aware or acutely aware of what's going on in the game because you've been lulled into this like, not boredom,
trance.
But into this trance.
It's a trance. It really is.
Versus Diablo 1, you still get into a trance, I would say, in Diablo 1 and 2, but instead of a trance of like kind of this almost like mind-numbing like monotonous sound, it's the gameplay loop. It's the loop that just the sense of satisfaction of just building, killing enemies gives you experience, which then you can choose how you want to level up. I guess we can use that to really dive more into like the specific mechanics of it. Every time you kill an enemy, you get experience, obviously. You can then, every time you get enough experience, you level up, just like in any normal RPG. But what I always enjoyed about Diablo 1 and 2 is that you could assign where you want those stats to go. So if you wanted to, and this was a really core design of the gameplay, they wanted to focus more on the action than on the story and character settings, which that's my type of RPG. I love D&D, but I'm the worst at role play because I just play myself. Like I can't put myself into a character. I don't have like, if you know how like some people will play a character where it's like they'll play a heal on purpose. I can't do that. I feel guilty playing a heal. So Diablo is my type of RPG where it was more about the stats and action than it was about the actual role playing elements of it.
Well, and I think there's something to be said for a less is more approach too, like on multiple levels. But if you're talking about like the story specifically, one of the things that was so compelling to me about it is that not everything was exhaustively explained. A lot of it is left up to your imagination, and the fact that even if you dive into the instruction book, which I did because I'm a nerd, but it was, I'll be honest, I've said this before, but in an age when cell phones didn't exist, you had to take something with you to go to the bathroom when you were going to be in there for a while, and video game manuals were my reading material. I'm just going to say that. And so
no shame. I would do it too. I brought my Halo 2 manual to church all the time instead of paying attention to the sermon.
See, there you go. So I've read through that quite a bit, and there's a lot of actually really great lore material in the Diablo 1 instruction booklet for PC. And but even that, like, a lot of it is still, it's hinted at, but never fully explained. And that's, I feel like that's the key. That's, again, going back to like Dark Souls. That's what makes that world so compelling, is that they have these hints of things that are grander than what you're seeing, or things that happened at a different time. But they only give you just a little bit about it and then leave the rest for you to kind of fill in the blanks. And that is such a great storytelling mechanism, because it gets you invested in thinking about these things, because not everything is spoon-fed to you.
And that type of storytelling is such a fine line to walk, because in some games, you guys actually covered it on your show, Final Fantasy 13, they give you nothing but proper nouns for like the first 10 hours of that game, and you don't understand a single goddamn thing of what they're talking about.
Yeah, what's a l'Cie? What? I don't understand.
Exactly. I've played 30 hours of that game like over a decade ago, and I don't remember a goddamn thing about the world.
Mm-hmm.
And that the reason I say this is because that is a fine line to walk. Final Fantasy 13, in my opinion, went too far over it. It went too far where it's like it's giving you a ton of information and not filling in the gaps so that way you can. But when you do too much of that, then the player's having to okay, I have 10 different things I have to keep track of, and I don't have the context to understand any of the 10 things. So you're left with nothing it's so hard to fill in the gaps with that. Versus with this, it's really one or two things, and it's very spaced apart. The setup for the story is that there is basically, from what I remember, it's because I played this game about a month ago. I was at the beginning of this game, about a month ago, but you go to the town of Tristram, and there is basically stuff happening in the monastery, and soldiers have gone down to investigate it, and they haven't come back, or something like that. Do people know that there's demonic stuff happening in the church, or there's just rumors in the beginning, right?
It's a little bit of both. So essentially what happens prior to you, the adventurer, kind of showing up, is the King Leoric was traveling with his son Albrecht in a royal caravan or whatever, and they were with Lazarus, who was the royal advisor. It's always the royal advisor, by the way. Do you notice that? Jafar. It's always that. He's always the bad
that guy who's always trying to deceive the king.
Yeah. But so they're traveling along, and they stop in Tristram at Lazarus's behest, and the king doesn't really understand why. He's like, why are we in this backwater town? And Albrecht goes missing. And we end up finding out that it's because Lazarus basically kidnapped him because he was under the sway of Diablo. And the whole idea was that the child was going to be a physical sacrifice. He would be the physical vessel for which the essence of Diablo would be able to enter the mortal realm. And so he had to perform this whole ceremony and everything. And he takes the kid way down into the catacombs, deep into underneath the cathedral in Tristram, and that is when crazy shit starts happening. And so the townspeople that are left after they start sending folks down there to try to figure out what's going on, and they don't come back, they have an idea that some heinous things are going on, but most of them aren't 100% clear on what it is exactly. Although, as you play through, you'll see that some of them have noticed some things, some of the Fallen. That's what they were. I don't remember what the name was, but the little goblin-y type guys.
Yeah.
Kind of showing up in the middle of the night in the town and stealing the tavern sign, things like that. But for the most part, they're we're pretty sure that some demonic stuff's going on, but we're not clear on what it is exactly. They get bits and pieces of some of the people that managed to make it back from the catacombs, but that's about it.
And that's the exact type of storytelling that's all you need. Just enough mystery as to like what's going on with the game world. And I think we'll get to the ending. The ending is one of the coolest parts of this game too, in my opinion, at least. Like in terms of story, I think it's one of the coolest aspects of the game that like it's very simple, but I really enjoy that. Yeah, and you even see when you first enter the monastery, there's like some of the king's guard like outside saying like basically avenge us, and they talk about this guy named the Butcher. And you don't really know what the Butcher is. I have played other Diablo games, so I know what it is, but I can only imagine back in 1997 when this first came out, I'm sure some kids already knew what Diablo was, like the idea of the devil, like just from the name alone. So I'm sure you could put two and two together, but it's kind of like one of those things. You know how when people first played Resident Evil, you didn't know it was necessarily zombies at first. So the idea of like this mystery was just as scary as what was actually happening. And I feel like Diablo kind of plays into that same mindset where you're not quite sure what to expect down there. Now, you know, like I go back and I've played Diablo 2 and 3, so I have like 20 plus years of hindsight already knowing this. So like that part of the mystery is gone. The way you described the plot, just to lay it out to the listeners there, I was able to put myself in like almost like my own shoes back. If I was like 8 years old, I was 8 years old in 97. So like if I bring it myself back to like an 8-year-old Josh, that would be like the most like, what do you mean he just disappeared in the catacombs? Like, what do you like? It would just capture my imagination. I think that like you said, simplicity sometimes is all that you need. When you try to fill it up with too many proper nouns, Final Fantasy 13, it can lose some of the charm that the story is trying to tell.
Oh, for sure. And like, it's the anticipation and the unknown that those are such critical tools in storytelling, specifically in something like this. And honestly, it's another one of the things that got lost, even in Diablo 2. I mean, as much as I love that game, there's a horror element to Diablo 1 that is such an integral part of the experience that is really not present in any of the future Diablo installments at all. I mean, they all still deal with devils and angels and what have you, but they never captured that same essence as this one did. And to your point, you get it right away. Like, you don't know all of that stuff about the king or Lazarus or any of that stuff when you jump in. The only thing you know is that the king's son went missing and some weird stuff is going on, and you're just a random adventurer that heard about this at a tavern somewhere and decided to come to Tristram and figure out what's going on, and maybe if you live long enough you'll be able to get away with some sweet loot or something. Like, that's literally it. And so when you go and you start talking to, you know, the few townspeople that are left, you get a little bit of context, and then as soon as you walk up to that cathedral, you have that dying soldier who's laying right in front of the cathedral, and there's this ominous red light just emanating from every window and door of this cathedral, and this dude is laying there bleeding out. And you walk up and he just says like, please listen to me. And he explains that, like, you know, we went down there trying to find Albrecht, and, you know, we came across this demon called the Butcher, and it slaughtered everyone, and I barely made it back, and please avenge us. Like, that's your setup. And you're just like, holy shit. Like, and as a kid playing this for like the first time, that is intense. Like, if I wasn't already hooked, like just right off the get, right there, I was just like, all right, I'm in. I want to know what is going on. And the great thing about this is the reveal of the Butcher is iconic for a reason, because in later games, especially Diablo 3 is the worst with this, because they took the Saturday morning villain approach where, like, the dude would just show up as a floating head in like a text box, like taunting you the entire time before you actually go and fight him. That kills any tension whatsoever, right? But all you get in Diablo is a name and the fact that he done fucked up a lot of dudes. And like, that's it. And then you don't know where he's going to show up or when or what he looks like. And then as soon as you get down there,
It's like level 2, right?
It is, yeah. It's not that far in. And fun fact, most players at level 2, if you fight the butcher right away, he will destroy you.
Yep.
But with the limited light radius that your character has in this dark dungeon, you're kind of plodding along killing skeletons, and then you come across this room, and you can see inside the room before you open the door because of the isometric viewpoint, right? And you see this room that is just full of gore and like impaled bodies, and you're like, what is that?
Yep.
And as soon as you click that door and you open it up, you don't even see him at first because he's hiding in a corner, and all you hear is his voice. It just says, "Oh, fresh meat." And that is the time when I think most people actually shit themselves.
It's just so ominous. Like there's heads impaled on spikes, and there's just bodies strewn, like, because it's not even just like gore. There's just like walls of spears, like just in perfect patterns, symmetrical patterns, jutting out of the ground. And he comes out. And he's fast too. Like he'll charge you. I actually was able to beat him with my archer. Because I played a rogue, I played an archer or whatever, and you can kite him around and beat him with some ease, but it takes a lot of time. You just have to keep learning how to like manage his, like how he attacks, and so you actually want to let him get close so he does a melee swing. So when he gets close, because he takes a wind up, then you go away and you shoot a little bit, then you rinse, wash, and repeat. You don't want to get too far away because then his range stuff actually can hit you pretty hard. But it's from what I remember at least. But yeah, it's an intense fight, and it's funny. Not to compare it once again to Diablo 3, I prefer the Diablo 3 version of the fight of the butcher because it's got like different mechanics. It's a lot more mechanically interesting. But this is also from 1997. Diablo 3 came out 2012 or 2011 or something like that. I don't fucking remember. 13. You're looking at like almost 15 years later. 15 more years of experience since then. And like in this one, it is still an intense fight. Like, because if you don't clear out the rest of the dungeon floor, you're going to be running into other enemies while this giant monstrosity is just chasing you, huffing it behind you, chasing you down. Just the whole way. It's terrifying. It's so good. And what I also love about kind of the mystique element of this is that there are extra hidden areas in the levels, but since the levels are all procedurally generated, every time you restart your game, the levels are the same in terms of like the themes. You have like your basement, then the catacombs, and then the caves, I think, and then there's like, you keep going down. It's like every 2 levels it's like another, you're getting farther and farther down, closer and closer to hell. And
it's every 4.
Every 4. Okay, so there's 16 levels, I want to say, total. I made it halfway. I made it to level 8 or 9 before it just got bullshit hard, and I got livid at it. But what I like about that is there was like a couple secret, like I think the tomb of the Skeleton King or something. I forget what it is. There's like these random like tombs or like different bonus areas that don't always spawn. So sometimes you'll be exploring, and it's not like it gives you outrageously better loot, so it's not like you've missed out if you didn't find it or if it didn't spawn for you, but it gives that sense of reward of replaying it, because this time you might, not only you're going to get different loot from replaying it, you're also going to maybe see areas of the game that you didn't even see before, and on top of that, the level itself is completely different than how you played it the first time.
Yeah, and not only that, but the quests are randomized also. So like when you play, you will not, well, this is assuming you're playing on single player. In multiplayer, it's different, but in your typical single player experience, every time you start a brand new game, all of that is randomized. And so you won't necessarily get every available quest in the game, but you'll get a subset of that. And so that, combined with the procedurally generated levels always being different, and also some of the, like you said, some of those special areas like the Halls of the Blind or like the Skeleton King's tomb, or like the poisoned water supply quest that gives you that like little extra cave area, things like that.
I did the poison water supply one time. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's always new, and that's what's really great about it. And like, there have been arguments that as games have progressed and gotten, more complicated and graphics become more intensive and things like that, that level of randomization is a little bit harder to pull off, which I can see, but at the same time, like there is something to be said for that. Like, that's one of the reasons that I go back to play Diablo 1, honestly, at least once a year, is because even though I've been playing this game for like, God, almost 25, 30 years now, like it's always a fresh experience.
I mean, it's still fun. It still has a fun gameplay loop. You can choose one of 3 different classes. You have the warrior, you have the sorcerer, or sorceress. I don't remember if they
sorcerer,
sorcerer. And then you have the rogue, and you can, obviously warrior is melee combat. Rogue is kind of like your ranger / ranged attack. It's more of, I think it's a rogue at least.
It is, yeah.
Okay. Your ranged attack, and then obviously sorcerer is your magic. What was kind of cool about the development for it, and Brevik talked about this in the video, was that they wanted to make it so that way every player could do a little bit of everything. So you could be a warrior, but you could still do magic spells. You could be a sorcerer, but you could still do like archery or something like that. You weren't, obviously the classes had different, they were already naturally inclined with a specific gameplay type in mind, but as a warrior, if you wanted to cast fireball, you could get a scroll of fireball and teach yourself fire, or you could get the one-off scrolls that would just let you do a one-time cast, assuming you had the right amount of points put into magic. So because it allowed you to split up the points as you saw fit into the different stats, you could do a lot of different things. You could really, like, if you played enough, you could like get max out stats on your warrior in one thing and start putting stuff into magic, so your warrior could be a tank and then also do a little bit of magic on the side type of thing. So it was really cool that you could do all that. In my playthrough, I played as a rogue because of the range thing. I think what kind of irked me about the PlayStation version of this, for the rogue specifically, is that I couldn't control where I was aiming easily. So in like the PC, you can click on the individual enemies. If there's a group of enemies and you're facing them in the PS1 version, you hit the attack button. It's up to the computer to decide which one you're attacking. Like, yeah. You can't, like, if one is about to die but they're all the way in the back, you're not hitting that guy for a while, even though they might be shooting fireballs at you. You're going to be attacking the guy at the front who still has full health, though even though it would make more sense for you to hit the guy that's basically already dead, and you can just knock them out and not have to, that's one less guy you have to deal with. So that was my biggest gripe with the PS1 version, was in terms of the combat itself. I also think the movement is very slow. Is that just me? Or is it like, do you move slowly in this game?
So comparatively, I'll answer that question, but I did want to go back and talk a little bit more about like the stat system and stuff. But yeah, it is kind of slow, especially comparatively to like games now, or even just Diablo 2.
I mean, like stamina bars. Diablo 2, excuse me, they had stamina bars. But anyway, sorry, go on.
Yeah, well, the stamina bar was kind of pointless anyway. But but yeah, that's when they introduced the ability to run, mostly because the areas in Diablo 2 were significantly larger than this game. But it is slow, but honestly, I feel like that's part of its appeal, in that the gameplay of Diablo is very methodical. Whereas D2 and pretty much any other action RPG since then is not. It's very sort of run and gun kind of style, and this was not that. It was very purposeful. Though there can be large groups of enemies, they're never just like these big waves that you're mowing down, so I could see that. And that's actually one of the things that I prefer in the PlayStation version, frankly, is you can move. It automatically moves you faster in town.
A little bit, yeah. I also, if you do a diagonal, like because I was playing, you have to play with the D-pad. So if you kind of jump from, moving left or right to up and to the, so say I was moving right and up, like diagonal right and up, if you kind of bounce back and forth between the right and up button, then you can kind of almost do this weird little wiggle move that'll like make you go a little bit faster, but it's not all the time.
Right.
But there was something you said there about the intent, like the methodical nature of the combat in this game. I want to say something on that real quick, and then I want to throw it back to you about talking about the stats, because I keep bringing up talking about the gameplay mechanics, and we in a good, and I think surprisingly I feel somewhat natural, we keep tangenting off, but still about the game.
Right.
So to kind of wrap up, at least to kind of continue on and hopefully wrap up, so we can move on to kind of like the aesthetic and music of the game, with the mechanics and combat of the gameplay, the methodical nature of it, I feel like definitely it makes a lot of sense because of what we know about the development, where it was originally going to be turn-based and permadeath. So I feel like that is almost like not necessarily a holdover, but that influence was never completely wiped off when they were developing this game, the influence of turn-based and permadeath, because that makes a lot of sense. This is a lot more methodical and a lot less run and gun, when the base version of this before it came out was turn-based. So it makes a lot of sense that it's a lot, you have to be a lot more tactical, in this game than you would in Diablo 2 or 3. But Shane, you said there was stuff you wanted to talk about with the stats for this.
Yeah. And yeah, just a final point on the movement thing. That, like I said, the PS1 version I think is superior in that, and also because that version also allows you to go into the menu and change your walking speed, if I recall correctly. So
does it? Damn it.
Yeah. I think you can toggle to like fast, which makes it a little bit better, but I could be wrong about that. But at any rate, that is one of the improvements. There are some other things, but we'll cover that in the aesthetics. But yeah, as far as the stat system goes, it really is pretty beautifully implemented. Like, it's not perfect at all, because when you really get down to the min-maxing, you kind of realize that for the most part, you can dump almost all of your points into like one stat, and you'll probably be fine once you know how to like game the system. But again, that's min-max territory. But the fact that any character class really is just sort of like a starting template, and you can kind of do whatever you want with it, is fantastic. And it's yet another one of those things that got lost along the way, probably in the name of, game balancing, which I've actually come to really hate that term, because there are a lot of games that get balanced into just homogeny. Yeah, exactly. And I hate that. This game does not do that, because it allows you to basically do some real crazy things. And that's part of the fun. Like, for instance, the Sorcerer arguably is probably the hardest class to play. And that's just by nature of relying almost solely on magic spells.
And having the lowest amount of health at the start. Probably.
Right, yeah.
Lowest amount of defense at the very least.
Definitely. Yeah. And part of that is because, and I'm diverting a little bit here, but it's related. Part of that is because spells are not just given to you. It's not like part of a skill tree or anything like that. It is, you literally have to find them. And it's another one of those things that's just part of the random nature of the game that gives you that sort of like just one more level kind of feel. Because when you come across a room that's got bookcases and like, tomes and stuff, you're like, oh yeah, this could either be full of a bunch of useless scrolls, or it could be some books where I can learn some new spells.
Another goddamn scroll of town portal that I don't need because I have the spell now.
Yeah, exactly. So that's part of the greatness of it, but I mean, it also can be a little frustrating. It also makes the Sorcerer a little bit harder to play because of that, because you can get screwed by RNG if you don't get some of the stuff that you're looking for. But as an example, if you wanted to play a battle mage, for instance, you can totally do that. Like, you can pump up your your intelligence skill, basically your attribute, such that you are able to cast pretty much any spells you want. And then once you've kind of capped that out, you can go and just start dumping a bunch into strength so that you can wear heavier armor. And if you play that character long enough, you can just be a caster that is in a full plate mail set, and that's totally okay. And that's awesome, you know? And to your point earlier, there are different relative stat caps for each of the classes. So you do have the flexibility, but there's really sensible like limits on that. Like, yes, you can learn spells as a warrior, but that magic attribute only goes up so high for him, and it gets capped really low compared to actually either of the other classes. So can he learn some spells that will help him out? Yeah, absolutely. But he's never going to perform at the same level as a sorcerer or even the rogue. But that makes sense, you know? So there's still some like sensible guidelines there, but there is a lot of freedom. And that's really part of the charm of it, is that you can create another character of the same class, since there's only 3, but you could build it completely differently. There's actually a really great rogue build that doesn't use ranged weapons at all and is just straight up sword and board, because like dexterity dictates your chance to block attacks. And since dex is the main stat arguably for a rogue, if you like max out your dex, you basically block attacks like 90 something % of the time. And so you can actually kind of become a tank, you know?
Yeah. That's really interesting. That actually gets me thinking, and I want to get your take on this. And I feel like this is something that was unique to my friend group or experience, but I want to know if it is, essentially. So I remember, this is kind of a more on a grander discussion of RPG design in general. And I say this, I bring all this up. So like, I remember when I first got into RPGs, my first like RPG that I truly got hooked on was Final 7, like a lot of people of my age.
Sure.
And I remember my buddy was saying, well, it's like, yeah, Final Fantasy 7's good, but you know what's even better? Final 9, because it harkens back to the older days when, you know, like your mage can't do physical attacks. You know, like in Final 7, there's no real classes. Everyone can do everything. You can kind of do whatever you want. There's no real, like, you know, you don't have your white mages, you don't have your black mages, you don't have your rogues, you don't have your you know, monks, you don't have all these different character classes that you would see in typical older JRPGs, and obviously tabletop Western RPGs and all that other stuff.
Right.
And for some reason, the vibe I got from my friend group, and I'm kind of pitching this out to the listeners as well. So listeners, feel free to tweet at me or contact me somehow, you know, send me a DM. Did you feel this too? Where like the quote unquote more real RPG was the one that had very strict character classes, where, you know, like your white mage, your black mage, or this and that, versus other RPGs that didn't adhere to that didn't really, like, you had stats and everything, but classes didn't really mean much. Did you ever feel that at all growing up, like where like one type of RPG was superior to the other, like the real strict class type or the kind of more everything type? Did you ever feel that, or is that just a me thing?
No, I don't think it's just a you thing. I felt some of that. I will say that my particular friend group was not huge into the RPG scene, so I think I had a little bit less than that. And I guess, well, I won't even say that I was an outlier, because like I honestly didn't have a ton of exposure to JRPGs until much later in life. But even
like Chris, no, I'm just kidding.
Well, yeah, kind of. Well, actually, that's kind of half true, because there's a lot of series that I just never knew about until I met him. But yeah, I still got that sense though, and I guess in a way, it's sort of, I can understand it, right? Because that was sort of the standard at the time, and if you were really into RPGs, you kind of came to expect that. I mean, even tabletop games then, and frankly still now, though maybe a little less so, just because there's just so many of them these days. But like back then, it was still very much that, like, you know, there's like, you have, this is your class, these are your class skills, this is what you're good at, and you have like this sort of one track. So I could understand that. And the thing with the flexibility that Diablo gives you though, is that I think it's walking a very fine line. And by that, I mean, I don't think it works when you have a game that has like 6, 8, 10 different character classes, because then that becomes overwhelming. It's actually one of the reasons that I've stopped playing some games, because they're like, yeah, here's like, this game has 12 character classes, but like also each one has like 6 different job changes it can do, and it's totally up to you. And I'm like, cool, I have decision paralysis now, and I'm gonna go play something else. So, and I know I'm not, you know, there are definitely people that are 100% the opposite, where they're just like, hell yeah, that is my jam, and more power to them. But I've always been of the mind that like I prefer a little bit more of a guided experience with that. But it works in Diablo because it is such a focused game. It only has 3 character classes. And so with those 3, within certain bounds, you can kind of do whatever you want. And I think that's why it works. If it was any bigger, I think it'd be overwhelming.
I agree with you on that, because as much as I like Diablo 2, the first class I played was a Necromancer, and any other class I try to play other than Paladin, it's hard for me to like really sink my teeth into it, because I have to learn a whole new class now. As opposed to this, it's one of 3 options. Like I might go back and try a warrior next time, just because the whole like I'll have more defense, I can take more hits. Maybe I'll even try a battle mage at some point. I think what I like about the level, like the leveling system and the whole like system in general in Diablo, is that even though you can kind of do a little bit of everything with every character, it still keeps those classes at their core. Like you mentioned, like warriors can only max out magic to such a number. You know, it doesn't go nearly as high as rogue or obviously mage or sorcerer.
Right.
So it's still Diablo. You said it perfectly, man. I think I'm just gonna end up repeating what you said, where it walks that line really, really well of being able to allow you to customize and do weird things with your characters while also still adhering to the limits of what class they are. Mages, yeah, you can get enough strength up to put up, to wear plate mail, but you're never going to be able to swing an axe as hard as a warrior type of thing.
Yeah, exactly. It keeps the sort of flavor of each of the classes, but it gives you enough of that freedom that you can do, I won't say anything, but you can do quite a bit with any of them. And so it's funny that you mentioned Diablo 2, actually, because that's part of the reason why I've sort of gravitated more towards Diablo being my kind of go-to, is because of the sort of, it's not even overwhelming because I'm pretty intimately familiar with Diablo 2 at this point, but it's not that it's overwhelming. It's that if I sit down, right, and I'm like, okay, I want to start a new character, what game am I going to play? If I look at Diablo 1, kind of like what you said, I have 3 options. Yeah. They each have like 4 attributes that you can put 5 points per level into, and you basically find any of your spells sort of along the way. So there's not a lot of like decision making that you have to do. Then if I go and look at Diablo 2, I'm like, all right, so let's see, which of these classes am I going to play? All right, I'm going to pick one, let's say, I don't know, sorceress. Okay, great. What build do I want to do now? Because I know that if I just sort of randomly put points into the skill tree for things that I think are neat as I'm leveling up, I'm going to royally fuck myself later. And then prior to relatively recent patches to Diablo 2, there was no respec option. So like if you put points into the skill tree and you realize that you maxed out like fireball, and then you get down further into the tree and you're like, oh neat, I don't have any points now for meteor or any of this other stuff. Yep. You're just, that character's just hosed. So you just have to start over again.
You have to be very purposeful in the choices that you make. That's not the right word, but you know what I'm trying to say. You have to be very specific. You have to know exactly where you want to put things and where to go.
Yeah, you do. And honestly, it's one of the detractors from games like that, because you basically have to do homework before you start playing. Like
min-maxing.
When I start playing Diablo 2, well, the thing is like I would argue it's not even min-maxing, because like you can actually very easily make a character that will not even be playable past like normal difficulty in that game.
We'll say I have stories about that I'll save for the Diablo 2 episode, but I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, and so like you have to go out to the internet and find a build and then follow that point for point so that your character is actually playable for longer than just one run through of the game, which if you're intending on sticking with that character for a while, you are absolutely going to do. And so that's why, to me, I think the more simplistic approach that Diablo 1 has is honestly favorable, because it is very much, and this is in the spirit of what Brevik wanted to do, it is very much like the sit down and play RPG. You don't have to think too much about a party of characters or their stats or which skills you're going to pick or any of that garbage. You just get in, you kill stuff, you get experience, you get sweet loot, and rinse and repeat. And it's a perfect gameplay loop that will just keep you like coming back over and over and over again.
That actually reminds me, that pick up and play nature of this game, much more so than its sequels, was intentional. During development, Brevik talked about how he wanted to make an RPG, but he didn't want to make an RPG where you're going to spend 2 hours in character creation. He wanted something where you could just go in, hop in, and you within 5 minutes you're killing monsters and not having to think too much about it. That idea actually came from, believe it or not, playing NHL 94 on the Sega Genesis, where they loved the pickup. Like, you could, two friends plug in a controller, hit quick play, and you're just playing a hockey game just like that. There's very little thought having to put into it. So Diablo 1, I think, sometimes games get thrown, people will throw out the maybe not for Diablo 1 specifically, but for original games in a series, people always say stuff like, oh, it's a lot more simplistic than the other games. And while that is technically true for Diablo 1, they added a lot of different systems and different mechanics in Diablo 2, 3, and I haven't played 4, but I'm assuming 4. And while that is true, it's not always a good thing that things get more complicated. Like, I still prefer Diablo 2 to 1, just saying that straight up. But
sure,
I can see your argument for this. I can see where you're coming from as to why this has been kind of drawing you in more than some of the other games. Because it's, especially as an adult, man, I've talked about this on other episodes. We don't have time to do long in-depth games anymore. If we want to play one of those, it's one of those things where it's like, all right, I'm gonna have to set aside 2 or 3 hours every night to work on this, and I'm hoping that I have you. It's almost like you kind of have this second sense as an adult of all right, I'm gonna actually have some free time over the next 2 weeks to grind out some stuff, barring some unforeseen circumstance, which of course then always happens. But
yeah, of course,
for the most part, you're able to kind of you almost have this subconscious, you subconsciously know when you're going to have more free time than you don't. So what is it? I want to do a big RPG at some point, and I know I'm not going to be able to play one anytime soon. So I am playing one, but I don't have a date for me to finish it. It's I'm playing Yakuza 0 right now for the show eventually, whenever the hell I beat it. But it's one of those things, I know I haven't been able to play it for 3 weeks because of stuff. So and with Diablo 1, I say all that, bring it back to Diablo 1, you don't need to set aside time for this. There's no big time commitment for this game. You can hop into a game, play for 30 minutes, and since the story is so light and the gameplay mechanics are very straightforward, you're not having to spend a lot of time to be what's my build again for this? How do I play my character again? Because it's different from my last one that I played on my other save file type of thing. It's streamlined. It's bizarre because normally, as the game series goes on, they streamline more and more things. And while they do that in the Diablo series, maybe in terms of how some of the controls work with how you can swap between spells and stuff like that. Diablo 3, I mean, for crying out loud, they streamlined the entire leveling up system, I think for the worst in my opinion, but they got rid of putting stats into everything, they streamline different things to make it more accessible, when in all actuality, sometimes you need something like this where it was less complicated. So the streamlining was built in almost by accident.
Yeah. Yeah. Because the thing is like, I don't think a lot of that was even necessarily intentional.
No, I agree.
On Blizzard's behalf. It was more of just a product of the time.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's certain limitations from a technological perspective that, you know, were just sort of just part of the process, right? But it was sort of a happy accident in that simplicity really is part of what makes this game shine like it does. I mean, and I 100% agree with what you were saying earlier, that bigger is not always better. And to just go ahead and continue with the cliches, like in this case, like less is definitely more. It just is. And like I said, that's part of why I've come to prefer it. And again, like I said, that I don't think that part was necessarily intentional, but to me, it has stood the test of time in a way that a lot of other games don't. And I'm certainly not going to sit here and say that it's perfect. And to kind of tie back to my little mini diatribe about Diablo 2's like skill trees and stuff, there is definitely still a possibility for you to just hose a character in Diablo as well. Like if you just put stats just in the total wrong places,
all vitality.
I mean, right. Yeah. I mean, you're going to learn pretty quickly that actually you don't need a ton of vitality, but that's a mechanics discussion that probably doesn't need to happen here. But yeah, it's possible, but it's far less likely. And I would probably also argue that like there's a little bit less of an impact there, in that like if you end up rolling up a new character, you're probably losing a lot less progress than you would in some other game like Diablo 2 or like Path of Exile or like any of those other ARPGs where you've sunk hundreds and hundreds of hours into a character.
Torchlight. You know? I like Torchlight.
Yeah, Torchlight. That's another good one. But yeah, I don't know. Where are we going from here?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I wanted to ask real quick before we talk about aesthetics. And we already touched a lot on the aesthetics in the world of Diablo in the beginning, but I still feel like there's a little bit more we can dig into. But before we get to that, I want to ask about the Hellfire expansion, because I know nothing about what it added, because I don't know if it was even included on my PS1 copy. So what the hell was the Hellfire expansion?
Right. So Hellfire. So this was at a time when Blizzard was not big enough to basically do everything on their own. Mm-hmm. So this was not the only third-party Blizzard approved expansion to one of their games. Because you also had StarCraft Insurrection, which was done by a third-party developer as well. And so Hellfire came along, I want to say it was like 90, actually it wasn't 97. It was not too far after the actual release, but it was produced by a company called Synergistic Software, and it was published by Sierra Entertainment, which if you were around back then, you definitely recognize that name.
Yep. King's Quest, Police Quest, like they did a lot. They are prolific in the 80s and 90s in PC development.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I will say it's janky. It's kind of janky, but it adds some interesting things. It includes 2 additional dungeon segments that are part of like a whole new like side quest storyline. And it includes like additional uniques, like unique items, different item properties that your weapons and gear can roll that weren't in the base game. It adds new spells, and it also adds a completely new class, the monk. Okay. So yeah, if I remember my behind the scenes Diablo lore correctly, there was supposed to be a bard. Yeah, there was a bard and a barbarian class actually that they wanted to include in the expansion that were unfinished, and they're technically left in the game files, so people have kind of hacked them into the game, but I won't say they necessarily work super well, and I think they were unfinished to the point where I want to say the barbarian actually was still using the warrior's sprite animations and stuff. But anyway, yeah. So that's that expansion. It kind of focuses on a different demon as the like big bad of the side storyline. And if I remember correctly, because it's actually been a hot minute since I played the Hellfire content, but I think they went with like a weird sort of insectoid route with that, where like a lot of the new creatures and like demons and stuff were very, very insect in nature. So that was kind of an interesting take.
Yeah, I'm looking at the Wikipedia entry now just as a little like a side reference thing to what you're talking about, and that's odd. And apparently Blizzard was not, I don't know, I'm sorry if you said this, but Blizzard was not happy that they weren't developing the expansion.
Yeah, I do recall hearing about that.
Weirdly enough, so one of my favorite things to do is go down random rabbit holes on Wikipedia. So the writer for the Hellfire expansion was someone named Eve Forward. Eve Forward is an American author and television screenwriter. She is the daughter of American physicist and popular science fiction author Robert L. Forward. Robert Forward wrote I'm not a huge science fiction guy, but the fact that it says popular, I'm assuming people know him. He wrote the Dragon's Egg series, which I've never heard of, but there's 2 different ones. And the Roche World series, all science fiction and like fantasy type of things. Eve Forward also wrote for television. So the writer of Diablo Hellfire also worked on the Legend of Zelda cartoon. Also worked on G.I. Joe Real American Hero, the 1989 through 92 version of the show. Nice. Worked on a cartoon called Hammerman, which was the MC Hammer cartoon.
Oh God, I remember that.
And also wrote for Biker Mice from Mars.
Interesting. Okay.
Sometimes the rabbit holes are just worth it. That was who would have known that the Legend of Zelda, one of the writers of the Legend of Zelda cartoon would go on to write Diablo Hellfire.
Well, excuse me.
I really hope that's somewhere in the Hellfire expansion. Like, excuse me, Diablo.
We can only hope.
I know, right? Let's move on now to the kind of like world and aesthetic, because one of the things we talked about, like the dark fantasy theme of it, that was also very intentional. They wanted to stay away from a high fantasy theme because that was so, between Tolkien and everything happening around that time. Like high fantasy was kind of is to an extent still but Dungeons and Dragons was high fantasy. Technically, right. A lot of Final Fantasy stuff was high fantasy. Like almost every RPG was high fantasy. So they kind of wanted to do something different, which is where they gave us the dark fantasy thing. Visually, I think they really nailed that aesthetic. Like even playing Diablo 1 on the PS3, man, it looks decent. Like I'm not saying it's great. I think Diablo 2 looks better, but that's also a newer game.
Sure.
But even for 1997, the visuals, like, they still look nice to me. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, I'm like aggressively biased, but like, yeah, I still think they look great. I mean, maybe not great. I think they look really good still. It sort of falls under the argument that we make a lot on our show, which is that 2D sprite work is always like categorically going to hold up better than 3D, almost always. I mean, nowadays we're at a point where you could have a game that came out 10, 15 years ago and it still looks like it came out yesterday because we've sort of reached a point of diminishing returns as far as graphics go. Yeah. But back then, that it benefits from that for sure. I mean, obviously, if you're talking about the base game, you're going to be limited by the resolutions that are available. Like the best resolution you can get in base Diablo is 800 by 600. So, I mean, that's not going to look fantastic.
The port on Good Old Games actually allows you to get better graphics. You can buy actually Diablo 1 and Hellfire for $8 on Good Old Games right now.
You can, and I would highly recommend that to literally everyone because that's a steal. But, well, there's also, without going too far off into the weeds, I mean, there have been some fan projects that are really fantastic. For instance, anytime I play Diablo on a PC these days, I always use something called Devolution X, and basically what that does is it tweaks a few things with gameplay, but for the most part it's about the presentation, and it makes it so that you can play Diablo in full widescreen. And so of course the issue with that is that the game was never programmed with that sort of thing in mind. So it's very zoomed out, so things get a lot smaller in order to get that widescreen view, and you very easily see the edges of the world because the developers never intended you
they
to
never
be
thought
able
your
to see
camera
that
would
far.
go out that far.
Yeah, exactly. But apart from that, it still looks and plays great. I mean, so with baseline still very good, with some very minor tweaking like on PC, still like very playable even today.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I played it on the PS1, and it's like, I think honestly, point and click action games are kind of it's a genre you don't see very often anymore. I know point and click action game isn't really a genre, I guess, but like there's very few games that I see that still play like this, where you click on like, other than Diablo and other ARPGs, like you don't really see it outside of this genre usually. But it still holds up. Like the both visuals and mechanically, I still think, other than the specific systems, which your mileage may vary on that, but I think visually it still looks really good. The enemies are still visually interesting. I watched the end of the game just to see what Diablo or their rendition of Diablo looked like, and it's awesome. It looks great. It still holds up. I also really like I think the color settings are really nice, though. The PS1 version I was playing, it was a little too dark to see, and I think it's just because of what I was playing it on. I feel like if I got it on PC, it'd be a little bit better. One thing, this kind of is like a weird bridge in between the aesthetics and like the visuals and like some of the world building and stuff like that, and the gameplay. The map of Tristram, the town of Tristram, where you go back to constantly. I fucking hate the layout of that map, man. It's like you have this wonderful town center where you have your blacksmith, you have Deckard Cain right in the middle, you have your like dude selling health potions on the side, and then where you get all your mana potions is all the way in Bumblefuck across the other side of the map. And then if you want to get super rare items, which I don't mind this because I understand kind of like the idea of it, Wirt, which I love the callback of Wirt later on in Diablo 2, but we'll save for later. But like Wirt, the weird little kid that lives on the outskirts of town,
the little peg-legged ruffian,
just like you have to pay him 50 gold just to see the items in his inventory.
Yeah, that kid's running a scam, 100%.
It's a Ponzi scheme. Not really, but you know what I'm saying. It's really amusing. I don't mind where Wirt's location is. In fact, it's even made more useful because when you get to a certain level of the dungeon, you can actually find a tunnel that takes you back up to the town, so you don't have to like go all the way up and go all the way back down. You can, I think it's like actually around level 8, like it's midway through the game. There's like a tunnel that if you take it, it'll take you to like a cave that's right on the outskirts of town near Wirt. So it's nice because now you don't have to walk down through 8 different levels to get back to it.
Well, actually, you get that every 4 levels, right?
Really?
Yeah.
Fuck.
Yeah.
I never found it.
Yeah. So basically the last level of every section, you get an additional stairway that is a direct line back up to town, which definitely helps with that traversal thing. But also I just think I always thought it was cool because like the town map literally changes. Like it's very minor, but it does. So like once you get to once you get to the bottom of the catacombs, because you don't get it for the first 4 levels, I will say that.
Mm-hmm.
But you get it for the other 3, because at that point you're pretty deep in. And you get oh no, that's what it was. Sorry, this train of thought, but it's actually the first level, I think, of each one. So
Okay.
like on the 5th level, so the first level of the catacombs, you'll find a staircase leading down to level 6, but you'll also find a staircase going up back to town, and you come out in what is basically like a little mausoleum that, if you were to wander over there at the beginning of the game, has a wrought iron gate over the front of it, and you can't do anything with it. And so you're just like, oh, that's window dressing. Cool, I guess. But once you get down to the first level of the catacombs and you find that stairwell, you go back up, and suddenly that wrought iron gate is down, and that's where you come out. And so then you can just go directly to the first level of the catacombs right from there. And so it's the same thing with the caves, like you were saying, is there's just a rocky cliff face. But once you get to the first level of the caves, again, you find that shortcut, and then suddenly there's a cave entrance that appears there right near where Wirt's hanging out. The last one you get is when you hit the first level of hell, and an actual like fissure, a crack in the ground, shows up like right to the left of
the bottom left. The only reason I
barmaid.
even know that, I looked up a map of Tristram while you were talking, and I see it on the map. So sorry, continue.
Yeah. So it's like, it's basically sort of in the top left of like the central town area is where that pops up. So yeah, it's a really cool thing that they thought to include there. So you get sort of like a shortcut back.
That is very handy and very like, there's certain things when I'm playing some older games where I'm like, that's very user friendly for this time period. Like I'm not used to something like that where they thought ahead of like, well, let's not waste the player's time. If they get to this spot here, let's have them be able to have like, a little shortcut to get back here so they don't have to travel quite as far. I think that, and on top of that, it interacts with the town of Tristram, which I love how in Diablo 2, like, Tristram's gone, but it's been swallowed up by everything that happens in the monastery there. I also love in Tristram in this game, like, since I know we've been kind of going a little bit all over the place in terms of talking about aesthetics, but in terms of like how Tristram itself looks, you ever watch almost like a medieval horror movie or something, or maybe like a medieval thriller where like, and the town feels so eerie, like the camera will pan through it and it kind of puts you on edge, just kind of exploring the town because you don't know what's going to happen in the plot of the movie. You don't know what's going to happen to your characters. This entire town feels like that. Like you always feel like you feel like this town's hiding something that you don't know about. And in actuality, it doesn't seem like the town's hiding anything other than because they're not hiding the monastery. They're just as baffled by it as you. But because of the whole vibe of the game, it always feels like there's just something else waiting behind like the house, like the next house down. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah, it definitely has a very sort of like desolate feel to it. Like the fact that even though the town itself is actually very small, and it's funny because like some of the dialogue, if you talk through like the gossip pieces and stuff like that, which I'm sure we'll get to here in a minute, but like if you listen to what the townsfolk have to say, they imply that the town was bigger before this happened, that there were a lot of townsfolk that basically picked up and left because they were just like, nah, screw this, I'm not sticking around to find out what this is, or the ones that tried to go down with the royal guards to figure out what happened to Albrecht and got slaughtered. But it's interesting because like I don't know where those people would live because
did they just
because
take
like
their
the
whole
town
house
is
with
like
them?
5 houses, so like I don't know where they would even be.
Did they just unpack, like move their whole house with them? Like fuck this?
Yeah,
Taking it
I don't know. Maybe
from the roots.
I mean,
Just
maybe
take
they
the whole
were all
thing.
just living in like double wides. I don't know. They just picked up and moved trailers. I don't know, but at any rate, even with that maybe little narrative inconsistency there, you do very much get this sense that like these are the last vestiges of this town. Like, this town is dying, and you only have these, what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, like 7 or 8 people that are left.
Yep.
And that is it. And even then, you basically have the bare essentials. You have the priest, you have the innkeeper, who basically has no one to, tend to. You have the blacksmith. You have the town drunk Farnham, who's hilarious. And then you've got Adria, the weird witch out in the bumfuck side of town. And then you've got the grifter up top there with Wirt. And then you've got like the barmaid. And that's pretty much it. And so, yeah, you very much get this sense of like, oh, we're in like dire straits here. And you're never quite sure like what exactly is going on or what's going to happen. And to kind of tie some of that back into sort of like the graphical presentation, one thing we haven't touched on, which I think is key, especially with Blizzard, because it's like their forte, is the cinematics.
Mm-hmm.
So the intro cinematic to this game is metal as fuck. I just want to put that out there. Like, I don't think you would see this all that often today, even from current Blizzard. Like, they kind of went back there with Diablo 4, and I give them kudos for that, because I'm glad they kind of went back to this. But for a while, they were very much like cartoony, WoW, more family friendly, kind of whatever. And this is 100% not that. Like, It's like, it starts with an abandoned town that looks a lot like Tristram, and all you hear is like the wind blowing and one shutter on a window flapping back and forth, slamming in the breeze. And then you get a shot of like a crow picking the eyeball out of a putrid corpse.
Yeah.
And like, yeah, it's intense. And so like, when you start the game with that as your baseline, and then you just show up in the town of Tristram, you're just like, oh shit, like, is this what I'm in for here?
It's like, I'm watching it right now as you're just, and it's eerie how spot on you are with everything. Like, from the
I may have
with the
seen
window,
it a few times,
just a few times. No,
yeah.
I remember, even because I think I started playing it on stream. I first started playing this on stream, and for 1997, this is not. I mean, this is no Square Enix with their visuals, but like at the same time, who was
right?
And Blizzard was a small studio at the time. Like, this wasn't like, like Square Enix, at least at that time, had over a decade of like runaway successes with the Final Fantasy series. So they had money to spend on that. This is like a much smaller team working on it, and like the opening cinematic, there's all these, you see like a coffin opening and like purple ooze on the inside, like red eyes in the shadows. Like, it's very evocative of everything that's going on. And then you see all the monsters kind of coming out and attacking this knight. A little cheesy now from modern perspectives what the monsters look like, but Diablo still looks fucking badass.
Oh yeah, and ending that cinematic with just that shot of Diablo sort of like obscured in the dark,
yep.
And that's like screech that he has at the end. Holy shit.
What a baller way to start a game. It's a really good, and the final cinematic, we'll talk about the end part of the story, because the story of this game, the reason we haven't really even touched on it much is that it's basically just a setup. Like, the setup that you described earlier, Shane, is really all the story that there is. You are trying to go down and see what happened to King Leoric and his son Albrecht, and that's really it. You find out, but that's it. There's no other ulterior, like, extra plot twist for the most part. I mean, I guess unless I shouldn't say that. If you don't know what's coming, then technically it's a plot twist. But from the setup that you provided, Shane, about how, the Chancellor or whatever his face is took Albrecht down, and the Royal Knights are going after him and whatnot, you can pretty much know where this is going. Like, there's not much foreshadowing even required. Like, if you've seen any type of like evil movie or like horror movie, what this guy's trying to do to the kid.
Yeah.
When you have a game called Diablo and he kidnaps him and demons show up, I wonder what's going on.
Right.
one other thing I want to bring up before I want to ask you about the gossip stuff, because I know very little about all the gossip stuff. I tried reading it and I just didn't give two shits. I know that's all world building and character building, but I just didn't give two shits. I know, but
but it's so good, and it's all fully voiced too.
That's what I was very impressed by. I was like, it's not great voice acting, but you know what? 1997. You know what? 1997.
Listen, Deckard Cain is a fucking treasure, and I will take no criticisms.
Yeah. I might actually leave our Sean Connery conversation in from the intro. We'll see. Listeners,
I think you should.
I just may. But before we talk about the gossip, one last thing I want to talk about, something we forgot in the game mechanics. This is very quick, but I at least want to bring up because we're talking about the town in general. Your town's essentially your bank. There's no like storage. You can just drop shit on the ground in town and it just stays there even after you save. Like, you can just drop your gold if because you will max out on, like, gold takes up an item slot, which I think is dumb. I always hated that even in Diablo 2. But if you run out of space, you can literally just warp back to town and just drop 5,000 gold pieces on the ground and it will stay there. Even if you save and quit and come back, it's still there, which is kind of awesome to think about. I kind of love that. So it's kind of nice. It's like a bank. When in Diablo 2, that shit's not permanent. You need to put it somewhere, otherwise it will disappear. That's like right. It will go away. So sorry, I just had to bring that up real quick because we were kind of talking about the town and the townspeople, and that's one aspect of the town that we didn't talk about during the gameplay. It's your bank, which I think is kind of cool.
Yeah, I mean, with the caveat that you're talking solely about single player. Don't try that in multiplayer because it will not work.
unless you have very trustworthy friends, Shane.
Yeah, unless that. Yes.
But no, if there's anything else you want to say on the items in the town, go into gossip, man. Like I didn't really pay a whole lot of attention to it, but I do know there's from what I did read, there is a lot of care and attention to detail put into it.
There is, yeah. I guess we could talk about that, and I know we're kind of like bouncing back and forth,
it's
but
fine.
I kind of feel like
I feel like this has been a pretty smooth conversation, all things considered.
Yeah, well, there's just so much to cover. Like I think we probably ought to touch briefly on the items, because like that's kind of a huge part of
the loot,
what makes Diablo Diablo.
The loot, the sweet loots that you got to pick up.
Right. But yeah, as far as like the gossip stuff goes, I mean, I'll be honest, I'm also one of those people that doesn't always pay attention to like the extraneous dialogue stuff. I used to do that probably when I was younger and had more free time, and also probably had more of an attention span. I don't know, but
same. Like
when I first played through World of Warcraft, I read every single dialogue for every quest. That did not last very long. but I really would suggest that if you play through this game, especially if you're only going to play it like once, definitely take the time to just go talk to the townspeople, because like I said, there's really only like a half a dozen of them really, and they all have fully voiced gossip lines that you can just listen to them say. It's totally unnecessary. It's all just fluff, but it really does a lot of great world building, like what we were talking about a while back, of just like giving you these hints of life, of like these are real townspeople. Like they had lives before this happened. Like they talk about, and I can't for the life of me remember her name now, but the barmaid, who actually doesn't really serve a functional purpose like at all in just the game, but she's just there. But like there's gossip lines like from Deckard and like some of the other ones where they're like referencing her grandmother, that her grandmother is sick and that she's staying in the town and not fleeing like she probably should, because she doesn't want to move her grandma because she's ill. And like you never see this grandma ever. But like that's just part of that world building that they put in there, that I think is actually pretty great. Like, and if you're gonna get invested into it, like, I would definitely take the time to listen to what everybody has to say, because they do a pretty good job of like building this little world that they've got here in the town of Tristram. And if you don't listen to anybody, at least go talk to Farnham the drunk, because he is hilarious. A lot have actually, even his quest text, and actually that's something we should probably touch on too, but his gossip lines are mostly completely nonsensical. But it's also like this very real mix of, yeah, LOL, he's a drunk, but also some like actually really heavy shit. Like, they kind of get into like why he's a drunk, like, and it really seems to have started sort of in conjunction with the things happening in Tristram, that he wasn't always like that, but like he lost a lot of close friends and family because of this.
Yeah.
And like he starts to get into that. And so it becomes like really real. So he's still an amusing character, but again, like he's more than just one dimensional. And speaking of like the quest text, a lot of people I think miss this because they don't make it readily apparent, but when you get a new quest, which by the way, this game does not do the WoW thing of just like, hey, there's an exclamation point, they have a quest for you. It's much more of the old school style of just like, nah, like you need to talk to these people. So when you talk to somebody or you discover something in the dungeon and you go back, you have a quest log. It's very rudimentary, but it's there. And as soon as you activate a quest, every single person in town has something to say about it.
Yeah.
So like, you can go and select that quest, and they will all have a unique, section of dialogue that they'll talk to you about that particular quest. So there's a lot of care that went into that. And again, the voice acting can be kind of hit or miss, but overall I think it's pretty good. I think Adria is like nails on a chalkboard. I hate her voice, but like other than that, I think they're pretty good. And I don't know. I think they're worthwhile to listen to.
Oh, and to piggyback off something you said before, where this doesn't really have like a quest. It has a quest log, but there's not like quest markers. Like even Diablo 2 has quest markers. I normally hate that shit because I hate the idea of just having to randomly talk to people who don't have a necessary dialogue. With that said, I don't mind it here in Diablo 1 because, as we mentioned before, there's like 6 people in the town. So it's not like you're having to run across different townsfolk and just have to hope that you're speaking to the right person, that they have something important to say. You don't have to like really worry so much about that because everything they say may not necessarily be important, but it will add world building. Because like you said, when you do get a quest, then you can then talk to everybody about it. And some people give you hints as to as to where to go next or where to find stuff about that quest. And
some of them don't know shit about it.
Exactly.
And they'll tell you, they'll just be like, I have no idea what you're talking about. And then in some cases, some of them will actually point you to other NPCs in the town. Like there's that one quest about the anvil where if you go talk to like the barmaid or whatever, she's just like, I don't know anything about that, but probably go talk to the blacksmith.
Which would make sense with an anvil.
Right.
But like at least they have like, at least it's one of those things. I harp on this a lot when I've ranted about like the Dark Souls games, where I can't stand when games don't respect the player's time. And I feel like Dark Souls is a major. I have a lot of beef with Dark Souls because of that, where I feel like that game does not respect your time. But that's the discussion, and I don't feel like getting anyone mad at me about that. But with this, I think it very much respects your time, both in the way that they handle the quests, because I did get a few. I never actually found the anvil. I don't know which level it's at, but I did get that anvil quest, and I spoke to Griswold about it. But between how it's very easy to travel back to town. It's in multiple ways, both with the Scroll of Town portal and also with the the passageways that we talked about every 4 levels.
Mm-hmm.
Also, even with how they do, you have to spend money to identify items. Yeah, it sucks you don't get a lot of scrolls of identify, so you have to go back to town frequently and pay like 200 gold to Deckard Cain to get him to identify the items for you. Dude, there's so much we haven't even talked about. Like you were saying, we've jumped around so much, but every time we go on to something, I'm like, oh, we didn't really talk about identifying items, and this actually might be a perfect accidental transition into talking about the loot of the game that you mentioned before.
Yeah.
But like you have to get them to identify items, and normally I would hate that shit because 200 gold's a lot, but they fucking throw gold at you in this game. Like I had like 10,000 gold on the ground in the town at some time. I'm assuming you're not buying weapons frequently, which if you want to be able to play at higher levels in the game, you need to. But
right,
for the most part, it's pretty fair. And one thing you mentioned to me that the reason I tried it, but it was going to take too long, in my opinion, is that you're supposed to take your character save file and start a new game. So like you get up to level 8, save your character, or whatever level of the dungeon you get to, save your character and start a new game, but with that level 20 character or whatever. And then that way, when you're going through the dungeon, you get going through level 1, 2, 3, and 4 again, you get more experience, and you can also have a better chance at items. I don't know if it's this way on the PC version. Released on the PS1, you get like fucking no experience on those first levels because you're level 20 going through it. I was hoping it would scale a little bit, but I guess it doesn't. So
no, it doesn't, and you're right. So it's an interesting thing, and I think this might be one of the very few like shortcomings of the game. Honestly, if I really am being
that's not
candid
just like
about
a
it,
technical shortcoming. You know what I mean? I feel like there's shortcomings due to technology and age, and shortcomings due to design. And I'm kind of with you on this specific element of it.
Yeah, I do think it is a little bit of a design shortcoming in that if you are playing single player, it is theoretically possible for you to play through the entirety of the game from level 1 to 16 in the dungeon in one go, in one save file, but that is highly dependent on RNG and also kind of you already knowing what to do, because it's very difficult. As you sort of mentioned towards the beginning, like it is pretty brutal as far as the difficulty curve is concerned. And I had to laugh when you messaged me in Discord about it, and you were just like, yeah, man, like I got to like, I think level 8 and it just like was crazy. And I'm like, yep, that's the point. Like that's the point where the difficulty just takes a hard turn, because for the first 4 and arguably even the first like 7-ish levels before you, or first 8, I guess, they're not that bad. It's can get some difficulty curve. Bad combinations. Yeah, it is. It's pretty smooth. It's manageable. Nothing crazy other than probably the butcher. That's an outlier. But for the most part, it's manageable. But typically, as soon as you hit the caves, that's when it starts to ramp up considerably. And partially that's due to how the enemies that are in the caves behave, because you get way more ranged attackers that are also using magic, which you hadn't seen a lot of prior to that point. You also get acid spitting creatures who leave pools of acid on your feet when the ball of acid hits you, which continues to damage you if you don't move. You also get rhino demons who, if they spot you and they have a clear line of attack, they will charge you.
Yep.
And you can't move out of it.
You can, because I was able to dodge it pretty easily. Sometimes.
I will say that there's a lot of cases that will happen, and I don't know if this is intentional or if it's sort of a bug or whatever, but there are times where if those guys initiate their charge animation, your character like will almost get locked in place. And so you just kind of get hit and there's not much you can do about it. But those sorts of mechanics you didn't see up until that point, because before that you're largely fighting like little goblin dudes with small dagger swords and like skeletons.
Yep.
And zombies. So like nothing too crazy. I think the worst thing you're going to come across prior to the caves is probably like the archers, because they suck if you get like a big pack of them.
Yep.
But other than that, not too bad. But how did we get onto this? Weren't we talking about items?
Yeah, well, so we got onto this because the way that you kind of have to game the system a little bit is that you save your character. Say you get to level 8 and you get stuck like I did, and you take your level 20 some odd character, you save them, and then you start a new game with that character. While you don't get a lot of experience by refighting all those enemies again, you essentially get a second chance at RNG. You get another chance to get new weapon drops, new item drops, new weapons that are available from both Wirt as well as Griswold, the blacksmith, and Wirt, the peg-legged boy who lives on the outskirts of town. Just what a ridiculous idea for a character. And I just didn't. That's where I kind of quit, because I'm like, man, I am not going to play through another like. Not grueling, but another large chunk of the game just to hope that I get good weapons this time. Like Diablo 2, I think I'll save that thought for when we get to Diablo 2, for when we talk Diablo 2 in a different episode. But I think that's where I really kind of fell off with this, because I like the gameplay loop, but when you get through those ranged enemies, and you don't have the item drops. I mean, this is one of the first games that really... No, it wasn't the first game. I think Angband that we were talking about before had that randomized item drop type of thing too, I think.
I think so.
Which was a major influence on this game, like we mentioned before. I mean, this game, there's so many... Like, I remember when Borderlands came out, people were like, oh, it's basically Diablo with guns. Like, Diablo kind of popularized this idea of... Looter shooter is an easy way to describe it. I know Diablo's not a shooter, but like looter shooter just rolls off the tongue than like a random loot RNG loot based action RPG, ARPG.
Well, I think at this point ARPG pretty much is synonymous with randomized loot.
Okay.
I
don't mind randomized loot, but I do think it's this game specifically, and I noticed it. One of the issues is that you don't get good items frequently, and while that's okay, it makes it a lot less enjoyable when you're not getting this constant sense of like progress. Because when you hit a wall, it's like in other Diablo games, you can play through. You can go fight another area, level up a little bit more, or you can and hopefully get some better weapons, this and that. In this, when you kill an enemy, they stay dead. When you clear a floor, that floor stays gone. So if you aren't high enough leveled for that thing, you better be really good at micromanaging your gameplay and kiting and doing all this other stuff and like finding ways to game the system, or you're gonna have to do what you mentioned to me, Shane, of like save the character, start over on a new thing, and just hope that the RNG gods smile on you this time. And that is a huge issue that I have with it, where it's just like it's not necessarily fun. Like Diablo 2, you would do like Mephisto raids and stuff like that, where like you would just reload a boss and just farm the boss over and over again. You can't do that in this. You can't farm a boss in this, and at least not that I'm aware of. Is there a way to farm bosses and loot in this without having to create new save files?
So there is, and I think it's similar to, I guess, kind of how you do that in Diablo 2, but with single player, you're right. Once you kill something, it's gone, and you clear everything, it doesn't come back. And so you kind of hit this point where either you need to continue pushing through, or like you said, you quit that game and you say start a new game with this character, and your character's progress, your loot, your gold, all that stuff carries over, but the game world resets, and the XP that you gain does inversely scale with your character's level, such that you will pretty quickly hit a point where the skeletons and the fallen and the zombies that you're seeing in the first few levels give you literally no experience. Yep. You'll kill them, you get nothing. And so at that point, the general philosophy with that is like kind of just blitz through, because they're really not going to hurt you anyway, and just like find the stairs to the next area and just keep going till you get back to kind of where you were. or kind of keep tabs on your character screen, and every once in a while, once you start getting further down, kill a few things and see if you're getting XP, and then you kind of know where you can start farming again. It's a little more micromanagey that way, but the better solution to that, actually, and this is actually how I play the game most of the time, is multiplayer, but by yourself. So you can create a LAN game where you just don't invite anybody. And so, like, because the multiplayer works differently, where if you create a multiplayer character in Diablo, every time you start the game, it's a fresh game. And not only that, not only is everything respawned and all that, but everything randomizes every time as well. And all of the shortcuts are open by default.
Oh, so you could technically just jump right down to hell if you wanted to.
Yes.
Interesting.
And so that's what makes multiplayer, in my opinion, the better way to play the game, even if you're not playing with anybody else, because you can basically just keep creating new multiplayer games and farm stuff, even to the point where, like, because Griswold, his inventory of items that he'll have available for you also is randomized, but is also dependent on your character's level. So, like, every time you start a new multiplayer game, you can just keep basically grinding the NPC vendor. Like, you can just keep making new games until Griswold has something available that's worthwhile, you know?
Yeah.
Not exactly the most compelling gameplay, but you can do that. But honestly, the bigger part of it really is just that you get a fresh game every time, and all the shortcuts are open. So, like, if you know, like, okay, my character right now can handle, like, you know, the catacombs, but I'm not quite ready for the caves, you can just start up a new game, hit that shortcut to the catacombs, and go directly there and just go.
That's nice. I wish you didn't have to do so much to circumvent a pretty big flaw, in my opinion, in terms of the gameplay. But
agreed.
It's still nice that I'm not going to give Blizzard the benefit of the doubt on this one, but it's nice that you can do that. But I don't think it was necessarily intentional. You know,
I don't think so either. Because I think if it was, it would have been a lot more obvious. Like, the fact that this is sort of a workaround thing that you have to sort of figure out by trial and error, you know, is not the greatest, but, and yeah, it's not an excuse, I don't think. Maybe you could give them a little bit of leeway just because of, you know, this was kind of their first foray into this, and it was 1996, 97.
I mean, really the first foray anyone had into this style at the time of, like, an action RPG like this. I mean, there was other game like Wizardry kind of had, you know, it was a dungeon. I think Wizardry, it was like that first person dungeon crawler, right? If I'm remembering correctly.
Yes.
So, like, this isn't first person, but the dungeon crawler element had existed before, but no one had seen a game like this yet.
Oh yeah, no, not like this at all. Not with the, well, relatively speaking, the faster combat.
Yeah, I mean,
like
it was, yeah. Real quick, we should start wrapping up this episode because we're going on over 2 hours now. I'm not surprised. We joked about at the beginning, like, oh, we can go 2 hours, and we definitely have. The last thing I want to talk about before we close out is just the story at the end of the game, how the game ends, the final cutscene and cinematic. Is there anything else before we talk about that, though, and how this game sets up the sequels? Is there anything else you would like to talk about that we didn't dive into yet? And just because I said it's like we're over 2 hours, if it's a big topic, we will dive into it. I have no issues with making this a huge episode. I'm actually kind of looking forward to it. I know this may be weird to say, but certain episodes when I'm recording, I'm like, man, I'm kind of looking forward to editing this later because it's going to be fun to listen back to this conversation again.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I'm glad that I'm not boring. I guess there's that.
Oh no, definitely not.
But yeah, so I mean, there's a lot more we could talk about, but
by all means,
I think
what's something that you'd like to touch on a bit.
Well, I mean, we sort of started to get into it, and then I think we got sidetracked about, like, the gameplay loop. Yeah. But the item system is kind of important in that, you know, yes, it is randomized loot, but the way that it does it, I mean, at the time was unprecedented, but now it's commonplace, really. But the funny thing about it is a lot of people tend to attribute like the sort of color coded loot thing to WoW, which to some degree is true, but Diablo did it first, and that's kind of where WoW got it from anyway. And so this is really sort of the progenitor of that, in that like we as gamers, a lot of us sort of intrinsically know this, even though it's like super weird to anybody on the outside. They'd be like, what the fuck are you talking about? But like blue is a magic item, like,
yep.
you know, like green is a set item, even though there weren't sets in this one, but
I always
they came
love
later.
the fact that there were sets in Diablo. Anyway, sorry, that I'm going to save that tangent for the Diablo 2 episode.
Right. But I mean, just those things, you know, like this game started that. And not only the color coding, but also just the suffix and prefix methodology that they have with the items. So like once you identify an item through either a scroll, or if you go talk to Kane and you see the name, if you've played the game enough, you can get a pretty good idea of what that item does for you just by the name based on the prefixes. And I think that's great. Like, it's awesome. It's a pretty minor thing in the grand scheme of things, but like if you identify a magic like ring, let's say, and it says like, you know, ring of the sky, you're going to be like, fuck yes, because you know that the suffix of the sky is plus X to all attributes, which is like one of the best prefixes that you can roll.
Oh,
so
okay.
Yeah, so those names mean very, very specific things. Like one of the best combinations is like, what is it? Like, oh God, I can't remember. It's something plate of the whale or something like that, because it gives you like a bunch of extra like bonuses, and I'd have to look at it again. But suffice to say, you can pretty easily identify things just by the names alone. And honestly, and I feel like this might be controversial, I don't know. But one of the things that Diablo does that no other game, to my knowledge, has really done since, and the Diablo games certainly have not, is that Diablo 1 like does not care about your feelings, in that like there are magic items that are bad for you.
That happened to me. There's like, you can get like there's like those shrines of different spells that'll give you different buffs, or as I found out, debuffs, where it permanently decreases one of your stats forever.
Oh yeah. Well, yeah, I was going to get to the shrines, because that's a whole other thing. But like even the items, like you can identify like a sword or something, and it'll just be like brittle sword, like, you know, -10 to strength. And you're like, cool. And not only that, it's like insult to injury too, because if you get one of those bad items, when you go to sell it, they're like worth like 1 gold.
Mm-hmm. So you spend more money identifying it than you do actually making anything off of it.
Yep. And there could be an argument to be made, and I've heard this before, where like you have this design philosophy of like, if it isn't fun for the player, then it shouldn't be there. I tend to disagree with that in some cases. And things like this, I actually appreciate. I like that this is included, because it adds that extra sort of like unknown element to the game. And in a way, and I know this sounds stupid because it's a fantasy game, but it kind of makes it almost feel more real, you know, where you're like, I'm just this adventurer person, and I went down into this dungeon of unknown horrors, and I found this magical thing, and for all I know, this shit could be cursed. You know what I mean?
That's a very D&D type of mindset, though. Like, that happens in Dungeons and Dragons all the time. And I don't think it's funny you talk about like what, you know, some people are of the opinion, if it's not fun for the player, it shouldn't be included in the game. Well, it's like, well, what's the definition of fun? And it's funny, our buddy Dave Jackson from Tales from the Backlog did a whole episode that I recently listened to with I'm trying to remember their name, Ryan from the Lightning Strikes Thrice podcast, and oh my God, I'm going to be so mad I don't remember the other guest. I'm going to look it up while I'm talking because I feel awful for not remembering them. But the whole episode was revolved around the idea of like what is fun, and are games being fun important?
Mm-hmm.
They talk a lot about that. And hold on, I have it like right here. Brad Galloway from the So Video Games podcast. So
okay.
Yeah. So Brad and Ryan, and they talk about it in the episode, and it kind of ties in with this where it's like, yes, on a technical level, giving a player an item that actively hurts them and feels like they waste their time is not necessarily fun, but I would almost argue it kind of ties into the caveman brain of gambling a little bit, where it's like, I could get something great, I could get something crappy. I won't know until I spend that $300 in 300 gold pieces in order to get it, so in order to identify it. I said before, I don't like games that waste the player's time, that don't respect the player's time. I don't consider something like this like that, where technically, yes, it's wasting your time. You lost time in getting the money that you earned in order to pay for the identify. You lost time in going back to the town to identify the item and hoping that you would either A, get something good, or B, something you could sell. And so you wasted time in a bunch of different ways, but I think that's part of the overall aesthetic of the game. And it doesn't I think the big key too is it doesn't eat up too much time. At most it's like 30 seconds. And like I mentioned before, they throw money at you in this game. So
yeah,
it is an inconvenience to the player, but it's not a big one. It's just almost like the right level of it. And you're right, like they really don't do that in other Diablo games. And I didn't mean to like bring up the shrines too soon. But once again, listeners, I'm sorry we're so all over the place with this. I feel like, I don't know, I normally like to have my episodes try to be a little bit more linear, or not linear, a little bit more organized, but I think there's just so much about this game that one leads to the other. And in a weird sense, and we'll get back into the discussion of the items in just a moment, I think it's almost a credit to the game where all of these systems, the aesthetic, the items, the combat, the storytelling, all these systems that the game shares with you, the player, blend so well together that you'll be talking about the boss fight with the butcher, and then you can't help but talk about the visuals, which then goes into the aesthetic of the game, which then goes into the story of the game, which then goes back and you start talking about the story in Tristram, and then you start talking about the design of Tristram. That's kind of like how our conversation has gone, where all of these systems mesh so well together, and it's honestly impressive considering they did this on a first attempt.
Well, yeah, I think just the fact that we can so naturally segue from one topic to another, I think really is a credit to the game's overall design, for sure. And speaking of design, just to kind of cap off that thing about the items and the sort of cursed ones, I guess, but I really do have to give props to the development team for an inclusion of something like that, because you're absolutely right. It is essentially wasting the player's time, though it's pretty minimal, but it still is. Like, it's not really benefiting you in any way, well, mechanically, but I think in a roundabout way, I think it does benefit the player in that they are staying internally consistent with the themes of the game. They are staying consistent with their vision, right? That you have this very desolate, dreary thing. You are delving into the unknown darkness below, like a haunted cathedral, basically. And there's a very real possibility that you will come across things down there that are not to your benefit. And though, like, from a very video gamey standpoint, that should not be a thing. Like, that should not be something that's necessarily included. I actually kind of wish that I would see things more often like that from other games, because it sounds a little hyperbolic to say, I guess, but like, it's a brave design choice. It really is. Like to do something like that, to where, you know, you'd be like, yeah, no, you may very well like waste your money and time on these things and they will give you zero benefit. Like, it's not even that it's a mediocre item. It is straight up detrimental to you. So like, deal with it. And to a certain extent, I really do have to give them credit for that.
I agreed. And I guess to give an example of like what I'm talking about when I can't stand when a game wastes the player's time, because we're kind of talking about it with this. And I promise I'm not going to harp on it for too long because it is Dark Souls. But like, so where I got a couple bosses into the first Dark Souls game before I kind of just lost interest. And really what killed it for me was I was fighting I beat this boss and I played a couple after this. So it wasn't this boss specifically, but this boss I think is the perfect example of my issue. And I apologize, listeners, you've heard me rant about this before, but I think it's worth bringing up here. The gargoyles in Dark Souls 1. And that's a very hard boss fight. I have no issue with the boss being difficult. I have no issue with that challenge. Where the game lost me wasn't how hard the boss was, because I knew the reputation of these games going into it. So I knew it wasn't going to be like something I'll beat on the first try, and I'm cool with that. I had the mental preparation for it. What I didn't have the preparation for is that when I die, the nearest campfire is a 5-minute walk back to them. And I wouldn't mind that if I didn't have to fight the same fucking enemies over again. And you can't really run past enemies in Dark Souls unless you have a long straightaway where they can't chase after you anymore. But to get to the gargoyles, right, it's a narrow corridor hallway, and then you have to try to climb up a ladder, and you climb slowly. So by the time you run past all the enemies, assuming they don't get in your way, then you start climbing up a ladder, and then they just knock you off, and then you have to fight all of them at once, as opposed to one at a time. So it really irked me where I'm trying to learn the mechanics of the boss fight, and I'm not taking any damage. I'm not even wasting Estus flasks at this point to get to the boss. And the game is still punishing me when I'm just trying to learn the mechanics of the boss. And that boss is super hard, so I feel like I can't even practice on it without having to spend 5 minutes of my life just to get back in the hopes that I can see the next part of the pattern.
Yeah,
that's a huge problem for me. I'm not saying it's a problem with the game. I understand the series is super popular. I'm not even saying the game is bad. I'm saying that's why it didn't resonate with me. And
sure,
that's when I say about it's not respecting the player's time, because I've proven I can get to this boss. Stop making me do it over and over and over again. If the gauntlet leading up to it was part of the challenge of the boss, I'd be more okay with it, but it's not. It's just there because it's there. It's just poor placement of the campfire. In this, an item wastes money and at most a little bit of time. And like I said before, if you generally the way you do it is that you get a bunch of items, you run out of space, and then you have to go back to town and sell it all. So realistically, you're not even wasting time. You might waste some inventory space, but the items don't despawn anyway. Like, you can come back and grab the other items you couldn't pick up. So yeah, it's really not a huge inconvenience. I think when you do something that is a detriment to the player in the way that Diablo does that here, it has to be minimal, sort of. Like, it has to be like a serious impact if the player kind of screws up. But like, if the player screws up, then I feel like it's a little bit different. But when it's the game kind of thrusting its own, like the player doesn't have a choice in it, like, you have to figure out what this item is. Okay, I better do that. I better go identify it. The game doesn't punish you for being curious, is what I guess the point I'm trying to make. Versus, or Dark Souls, I wouldn't say it's punishing me for being curious. It's punishing me for playing the game. And that was where my issue with that game. This wasn't punishing me for playing the game, because one of the big mechanics in Diablo is loot, is the random loot, is trying to explore every nook and cranny, kill every enemy so you can get those sweet loots and identify them, get some new items. And the game doesn't punish you for that. Yes, it gives you something that's not helpful, but that's not necessarily a punishment. It's almost like the reward is a joke. Like, I can't believe the game gave me this type of thing.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I guess along those same lines, just really quickly, because I guess we probably ought to move on. It's just the shrines, right? Because they sort of adhere to the same sort of like methodology in that some of them will be super beneficial, and some of them, like you mentioned, will just straight up remove, X number of points from one of your attributes, which is insane if you really think about it. But they did it. And I mean, you can game that a little bit because, again, all of the shrines are also named. And so each type of shrine does a specific thing. But if you go into this game blind, you do not know that unless you just trial and error it. And I think that's where some of the like rogue elements come into play here. In that, much in the same way that in like any sort of like roguelike or like real hardcore roguelike, picking up like a potion, if you've never seen that potion before, like you have no clue what it does until you drink it, right? And it's the same deal here with those shrines of you don't know what it's going to do until you interact with it. And honestly, even then, you kind of still don't know what it does because you'll get like a text pop up that just says some cryptic shit. And then you're like, well, something happened. And like, if you don't know like what your stats were prior to clicking on it, you might play the rest of the game never knowing that you just lost like 5 dexterity or something.
I found out the hard way with that because I'm actually watching a long play of it now, kind of as we're talking, just to kind of stay in Diablo mode. And there was the guy just got a shrine that said, some grow weaker as other grow stronger. And basically it's like it's removing some stat points and putting it into others. So I remember I was playing it. I had just put enough strength in to wear a specific like helm or cloak or like some type of armor, and I got that shrine and I lost the strength. So I was like, no, I can't wear this sweet armor anymore. You got to be kidding me. I was so mad.
Yeah, that's why my general rule of thumb is I just don't use shrines ever.
Oh, that's when I started looking shit up where I'm like, okay, I'm not taking any chances on this anymore. I'm going to see what each of the shrines do, which yeah, I mean, it's gaming the system a little bit. I maybe shouldn't look up a guide, but I just didn't want that to happen again.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you want to talk about though before we move on to just the final cutscene and kind of to wrap up the story and kind of the final chat on the episode?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we would be remiss if we didn't at least give a shout out to Matt Ullman, because his soundtrack is absolutely phenomenal and he is a legend. The Tristram Town soundtrack, that track is just so iconic and it's so well done. It captures the feel of the game perfectly. It's just this like very melancholy classical guitar track with these very ominous sort of like not necessarily like a horn section, but there's ominous like stuff going on in the background, and it's just this perfect balance of exactly what the feeling of this game should be. And that's just that one track. Like the music for each of the different areas as well, especially the first 4 levels, like the right under the cathedral, just the very like tribal almost sort of drum beat with the very haunting just like vocalizations happening. And if you listen closely, you also hear like screams of like agony or like moans and stuff going on in the background, and it's just dripping with atmosphere. And like I can't gush enough about it because it's just so masterfully done. And though there are some really great tracks from Diablo 2 and honestly not really Diablo 3, I don't remember anything about music in that game.
I remember the cinematics were really pretty.
Yeah.
And that's about it.
I mean, there are definitely some iconic music from Diablo 2 to be sure, but I don't think it tops just how well the music nails the atmosphere of Diablo 1. It's just I don't say anything is perfect, but like I just feel like this is really close.
I mean it really feels perfect for the game. Like it fits the atmosphere. I actually was watching the long play. I actually turned the sound back on temporarily, just down low, just so I could hear the Tristram Town music you were talking about. Like it fits with the vibe of the town. I was trying to look up to see if like what else Matt Uelmen has worked on, and obviously the Diablo games. He also did Warcraft, World of Warcraft, Burning Crusade. He quit though. Like he did do some work on Diablo 3, but he wasn't with Blizzard at that time. He quit Blizzard in 2008. He works currently for Runic Games, and his most recent soundtrack, according to Wikipedia at least, is Torchlight. Because I forgot all the Diablo 2 developers jumped ship and created the Torchlight series.
Yeah, well, some of them. Yeah. Then we had Bill Roper and the other guys who went and did Flagship Studios and tried to do Hellgate London, which I could go on about that one too, but that's an entirely different episode.
I've heard that game was ahead of its time. I don't know.
It absolutely was. No, 100%. Like it
wasn't popular at the time. It's a
tragedy.
But it like in retrospect, people are like, "Wow, this was like way ahead of its time."
It's tragic. That game was rough as hell, but it was very ahead of its time, and I enjoyed it a lot, and I was really sad to see it fail, because I think had it come out maybe a decade later or something, that we'd still be talking about it, I think.
You know what? Maybe if I can find a copy of Hellgate London, you can buy it for $13 on Steam. Oh, wait, this is the...
Yeah, don't buy that one.
This is the remake in 2018. Okay, then.
Yeah, that's the Korean version. Don't play that one.
Okay, good to know. Good to know. Something else. You know what? I keep saying like we gotta end this, and then I keep thinking up one other thing. The cow level. We would be remiss if we didn't talk about one of the greatest non-existent levels of all time.
True. Yeah. There is no cow level.
There is no. Yes, that was a rumor back then, where it was one of the, essentially like a playground rumor, you know, like, but back in the mid 90s, where there was rumors going around that there was a hidden cow level in Diablo 1. They Blizzard, you know, finger on the pulse, did bring it up later on in Diablo 2, which we will get to. But it's amusing to me that's one of those things where it's like, you know, you won't see that in necessarily like playing the game, because if you know, this is why I always talk about context in game history is important, because that was a huge talking point for years about this hidden cow level that just never fucking existed.
Well, I think a lot of that spawned from the fact that I'm pretty sure if you go over into that sort of empty area where the cows are hanging out in Tristram, I believe there's I might be mixing things up now. It might have been in Diablo 2, but I think there was one dead. Is there a dead cow? Maybe that was Diablo 2 Tristram. I know there's one where you click on, and if you click on it enough times, it explodes.
I don't know.
I'm trying to remember if that was in the first one or not.
It might be in Diablo 1. So I'm looking at that same map. I can't really zoom. I can only zoom in so far. On it, but yeah, there's like these random, like in the middle of, like, no one's watching them. You have the town center, you have the witch over in Bumblefuck, and then on the other side of the river in Bumblefuck, there is like just random cows just hanging out.
Well, I mean, you know, we didn't mention it, but I guess that is one thing that they added in Hellfire is the NPC that you talk to get that side quest is like a farmer who's hanging out over by the cows. So I guess they closed that plot hole.
So they confirmed there is no cow level in Hellfire.
That's right.
I just had to bring it up real quick because it's part of the lore. It's part of the lore of the game. Because in Diablo 2, they've confirmed obviously there is no cow level, but it just, what is it? It was such a pervasive rumor that in StarCraft it was a cheat code.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's just wild to think about, like how pervasive it was, though. How it was just. Did you fall for it? Did you ever believe there was a cow level?
No, I didn't have enough of that playground chit chat about that to believe that one, but I was aware of that bouncing around as a rumor, though. Also, I just double checked while we were talking, and I was conflating Diablo 2 with Diablo 1. The exploding cow carcasses are in D2.
Oh, okay.
The cows in Diablo 1 do nothing. Although part of the rumor was that if you clicked on the cows in the correct order, it would open a portal.
I think that's where it came from. Yeah. Anything else though? I don't. Anything else you'd like to touch on before we close it out?
No, man. I think we should hit on that last cutscene and then get on out of here.
Well, dude, thank you so much. So let's wrap up this episode, right? Let's talk about the final cutscene of this game. What a fucking metal way to end a game. So
hell yeah.
You play canonically in the world of Diablo. The warrior is the one that defeated Diablo, and that's what happens to spawn off the sequels and everything. But basically,
right.
You get to the bottom of the 16 levels. You fight Diablo, or what you find out later is the incarnation of Diablo, the possessed soul of Albrecht. Is it Albrecht again? Sorry, I'm just blanking on his name, even though we said it earlier in the episode.
Yeah, Albrecht. Yeah.
Albrecht. Damn it, I forgot the L. Albrecht. And he's possessed by Diablo, and it's because there's a soul, this thing called the soul stone, which is embedded into his forehead. And so you your character takes a knife and cuts it out of his forehead, and he shrinks back to his normal self, and it's just a lifeless body now of Albrecht. Like he's gone. Diablo killed him and possessed his body. Mm-hmm. And you take the soul, like the last thing you see in the cutscene is, because it's from a first person perspective, you see the soul stone in your hand and you're shoving it into your forehead. And the game.
Well, and I think that's the really important point there, right? Is that it's first person. Yeah. Like that is so crucial to that moment, because like if you were looking at the warrior from a third person perspective and this happening, like it'd still be cool, but it does not have nearly the same amount of impact as this does, because like you are in that first person perspective. You see your hand go and pry this thing, this jagged soul stone out of this, demon's head. He turns back into Albrecht, and then you literally kind of take your hand with the stone and you sort of like turn it over a couple times, like you're contemplating like, what the hell am I going to do with this thing? And I don't think anyone would have guessed that this is what you ultimately end up deciding to do, because as a player you're probably like, I don't know, shatter that bitch or something, like get rid of it. And nope, you just turn that sharp pointy thing right directly into the camera and then just lodge it right into your own head.
And I think the fact that it's first person, like you said, because it immerses you because it's first person, but I also think it kind of plays into the almost like Hitchcock type of vibe, where it's like your imagination is worse than actually seeing it. So you're seeing the stone going towards the camera, so you're just imagining like, what if I did that to myself? Like just stabbed myself in the forehead with a sharp pointy rock. And that leads you, which will stop the story at this point, I guess, but we can still gush about the end cutscene, of course, but like that leads you to the opening cinematic of Diablo 2, where you see this guy who's called the Wanderer, I believe, at that point.
Yes, the Dark Wanderer,
who kind of pulling a Lord of the Rings Gollum type of thing, who's like basically he's like trying to, I don't think it was necessarily the intention. The vibe I got from this ending was that Diablo, Satan, the devil, whatever, was still like has such a powerful influence on people through this soul stone, similar to the ring in Lord of the Rings, where I bet you when your character pried that out of it, had no intention of doing that, but holding it in your hands, you couldn't get rid of it, so puts it into a forehead because that's what Diablo wanted you to do. And now you're kind of like this husk of a man trying to wander around and try to stop use your body, like sacrificing your body to keep Diablo at bay, kind of.
Yeah, well, not not to completely deconstruct your argument that you just made, but no, actually, it was canonically that is the decision that the warrior. I'm not going to call him Adrian because fuck that. Like,
yeah, they retconned a whole bunch of
but
shenanigans. I know.
Oh god, it's like, oh, he's the son of Adria the witch. Fuck off. But anyway, that's a story for another time. But no, the warrior, that was his decision ultimately, is that he understood that basically Diablo's essence kind of had to, the soul stone itself, and this is going into some deep Herodric lore, I guess, from Diablo. But the Herodrim created the soul stones with the sole purpose of like capturing the essence of the prime evils primarily, but it could also technically be used for some of the lesser evils if need be. But for capturing the essence of them so that they could not manifest in Sanctuary, the Earth, basically, the Earth analog of this universe. And so part of that deal is that they weren't perfect, and they realized that those soul stones could not contain primeval essences in perpetuity on their own. And so they needed to really have like a volunteer host to use their body and their personal strength to kind of lend strength to the magic of the soul stone to help contain that essence. And so that goes into like Diablo 2 when you get like Tal Rasha and he was chained up and containing Mephisto and blah 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 blah. But like that's ultimately what the warrior does there. It's just like, well, I know that this is going to come back later, and I'm pretty strong because I just defeated this guy, so I guess this is the only thing to do. And it's sort of like a martyr move, and that's why he does it. But then of course, you know, the events of Diablo 2 happen where even the mighty warrior who defeated Diablo ultimately can't contain him. And arguably has actually made matters worse because now Diablo has a vessel that's way stronger than like a 12-year-old boy.
Yep. Yep. It's a cool story plot beat though. Like, and it's funny because so Diablo 2 in true me fashion, I barely paid attention to the story in that as well. Though I think when I replay it for the show, eventually I will pay a lot more attention to the story, because like this one, I knew there wasn't a whole lot of story to begin with. It's a very bare bones thing. But as with a lot of cool media properties, I feel like the first thing in it always does, they keep it simple so that way it makes it easier to expand upon later on. And I understand there is a fine line to walk between over explaining things and under, like, you know, how much should you leave to the player's imagination, that kind of thing. And I generally think Blizzard does a decent job of not over explaining too much. I know they do sometimes, obviously with the retconning of the warrior, which I don't even know too much about. I just know they retconned it and made him, like you said, he's the son of some witch or something. Like, you don't need all of that. Like, you don't, like, he could just be a generic warrior, but like all the lore of like the Herodrim that you just like rattled off, that's interesting shit that like I felt is a worthy like a good addition to the lore of the world. It's not over explaining something, it's just explaining something.
Yeah, and you're right. It is a pretty fine line. And Diablo 2, I think, did just fine with that. I think it was a beautiful expansion on what the foundation that they had laid with Diablo. And they very purposefully left a lot of that open-ended. And then part of the magic of Diablo 2 following this game was that you got to see those places that were only talked about in the first game. And that's awesome. Diablo 3 didn't really do that so much. It was a lot of retreading and then a lot of retconning of existing lore, which honestly was kind of insulting to, you know, fans of the series, and also a lot of just nonsensical additions, or in the case of the untimely death of Deckard Cain, definitely unnecessary subtraction. But I'm not salty about that. It's fine.
Don't worry, Shane. We will have plenty of salt to spread around when we get to Diablo 3, because there's a whole story about the launch of that game too, of course. So, let's wrap up this episode, though. This has been a wonderful conversation, man. Thank you so much for joining me for this. I love getting to talk Diablo, and also I learned a whole bunch about the world and lore of this. Like, there's so much. It's one of those things where it's like, how deep could the mechanics of the game be? And it's one of those things, until you dive into it with someone who's really knows their shit on the series, you don't realize it. So I really enjoyed learning a lot about this game. So thank you for coming on.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, thanks for having me on, man. Like I told you when you first kind of floated the idea to me, like I am always more than happy to nerd out about Diablo to basically anybody who's willing to listen. So thank you for providing a venue for that.
Dude, anytime. Like I said, I will have you back on for Diablo. Honestly, all the Diablos, let's be real. You're stuck with me on this. So
that's fine. I'll take it. I'm down with that.
I will have to replay Diablo 2 though. But in any case, so yeah, let's do our plugs. Let's wrap up this episode in true still loading fashion. So Shane, where can the good people find you online, and is there anything you'd like to promote?
Oh snap! Well, I suppose there is. Yes, we do a little podcast thingy of our own. It's called the Retro Hangover Podcast. Myself and my illustrious co-host Chris Copleen. We've been at it for like, I don't even know, like 8 or 9 years now, which is insane. But if you happen to like what's going on here on this show, then perhaps you would also like what we do. We spotlight a game, usually a game. Sometimes we'll do an episode on like a console or perhaps like an industry figure, but by and large, it's focusing on one game at a time. And we share our personal experiences. We give a brief history, so you can't ever say you didn't learn anything by listening to the Retro Hangover podcast. There are some things that you learn that you probably don't want to know, but that doesn't have anything to do with the brief history. And then we kind of go through, much like what we do here, we kind of go through some categories as far as, what we talk about, the graphics and the gameplay. And then ultimately we decide whether or not it still holds up today and whether it would be, worth your time to check out. So if that sounds interesting to you, then all you got to do is head over to our Linktree. So that's Linktree/Retro Hangover. You can find the show there, as well as like all of our other goodies, our socials and YouTube and all that fun stuff.
And I highly recommend the show, listeners. I've been on the show once for Allied Assault and also for their King of Games series, which it was behind the Patreon wall. Now the King of Games 92 is coming out to actually I think it wrapped up. It's completely wrapped up now at this point, but keep an eye out. There's always another King of Games coming at some point. So that's a little hint.
That's right.
But yeah, I highly recommend the show. It is one of my favorite podcasts to listen to. Actually, at the time of recording this, I just finished up your episode with Dave Jackson from Tales from the Backlog on Metal Gear Solid, which was a really fun episode to listen to.
Ah, yes. Metal Gear.
I have to read it that way, but yeah. So as usual for me, you can follow me on all the social medias at Still Loading Pod, Twitter, Blue Sky, Facebook, Instagram, all that good stuff. Twitch at Still Loading Pod. At Still Loading Podcast on YouTube. If you want to support the show, you can do so in a number of ways. You can give it a 5-star rating or review on Apple Podcast or whichever podcasting app you use, because it makes me feel warm and fuzzy, and I always like feeling warm and fuzzy. If you want to support the show monetarily, you can actually do that. I keep forgetting to say this. I have merch. There's Still Loading Podcast merch on. You can go to my website, stillloadingpodcast.com, and there's a link to the TeePublic site where you can get like Still Loading Captain N shirts if you're a fan of my Captain N series, and there's just the logo on. I mean, if you want, you can get the logo on a phone case. I don't know if you're crazy, if you really want to, but yeah, you can check it out there. But there's also a patreon.com/stillloadingpod. For $1 a month, you get all the episodes a few days earlier with better audio quality, as well as access to patron voting rights. So it helps guide the direction of the show a little bit. There's quarterly polls, and you can pick a game for me to cover based off those. For $4 a month, you'll get everything at the $1 level plus two mini bonus episodes every month. And then at the $5 level, you get everything at the previous two plus access to Still Bonding, which is my monthly James Bond podcast where me and a couple friends bond over 007. It's the only James Bond podcast where me and a couple friends bond over 007. So yeah, patreon.com/stillloadingpod. But of course, I want to shout out my friends over at the Bit by Bit Foundation, they're a nonprofit organization whose mission is to put video games and video game consoles in the hands of kids who are receiving inpatient care at hospitals. So if you want to support them and help hospitals, basically help provide hospitals with game systems for kids to play while they're waiting for their treatments, go to bitbybitfoundation.org and consider donating. And that is all the time we have for this episode. Shane, thank you once again for joining me.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on, man. I'm looking forward to the next one.
And I'm looking forward to replaying it and having you back on for that. So with all that said, everyone, thank you all for listening, and I will see you all next time. I always go into Sean Connery when I do Deckard Cain.
He's like one step away from Sean Connery anyway, so it's fine.
He's the poor man's Connery.
Well, hey now.
Or the Connery's the poor man's Deckard Cain.
That's we'll go with that one. I prefer that, actually.
All right.